Eun Kyung stood in front of the tall glass doors of Hanbada law firm, her reflection staring back at her. The towering building loomed over her, casting long shadows across the busy Seoul street. This was the day she had been working toward for as long as she could remember, the day she officially began her career as a lawyer. But the excitement she had felt when she received her acceptance letter was now buried under layers of anxiety. Hanbada was one of the most prestigious law firms in South Korea, known for handling high-profile cases and employing the brightest legal minds. Eun Kyung had worked tirelessly to get here, acing every exam, pushing through sleepless nights of studying, and standing out in a competitive field where excellence was expected. With a photographic memory and an IQ of 164, she had graduated at the top of her class from Seoul National University, one of the most difficult law schools in the country. Yet, as she stood there, the bustling world of legal professionals and office workers flowing around her, Eun Kyung felt deeply out of place. Her hand hovered over the handle, hesitant. She knew why she was feeling this way. It wasn't because she doubted her knowledge or skills. It was because, no matter how brilliant she was, no matter how much she excelled in her studies, there was something about her that always made her feel like an outsider. She was on the autism spectrum, a fact she had lived with her entire life, but had never truly figured out how to reconcile with the world around her. Social interactions had always been difficult. The unspoken rules, the subtle cues in body language, the expectations to make small talk, all of it felt like an intricate dance she hadn't been taught. The firm's door slid open as someone passed through, breaking her out of her thoughts. She took a deep breath, adjusted her blazer, and stepped inside. The lobby was sleek and modern, all marble floors and glass walls, with a high ceiling that made everything feel even grander. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the distant hum of conversations and the tapping of keyboards. It was an environment designed to impress, to remind everyone who entered that they were in the presence of power and influence. She approached the front desk, where a receptionist greeted her with a polite smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'm Eun Kyung," she said, her voice coming out softer than she intended. "I'm starting today as a junior lawyer." The receptionist nodded and checked her list. "Welcome, Miss Eun Kyung. Mr. Do Yun, the managing partner, will be meeting with you shortly. Please take a seat while I let him know you're here." Eun Kyung sat in one of the plush chairs in the lobby, her hands fidgeting slightly in her lap. She tried to focus on the details of her surroundings to calm her nerves, the texture of the upholstery, the sound of her shoes against the polished floor. But the weight of what today represented was heavy. She wasn't just here to prove herself as a competent lawyer. She was here to prove that she could fit into a world that had never fully understood her. Moments later, a tall, sharply dressed man with a confident gait approached her. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, and he carried an air of authority without arrogance. This was Mr. Do Yun, one of the senior partners of Hanbada. "Miss Eun Kyung?" he asked, extending a hand. "Welcome to Hanbada. I'm Do Yun. I'll be overseeing your work for the first few months." Eun Kyung stood, shaking his hand with a firm grip, trying to project the confidence she wasn't quite feeling. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Do Yun. Please, call me Do Yun," he said with a smile, gesturing for her to follow him. "We're excited to have you here. Your academic record speaks for itself. Top of your class at SNU, excellent performance on the bar exam. I have no doubt you'll do great things here." Eun Kyung felt a small swell of pride at his words, but it was tempered by the familiar undercurrent of anxiety. She had heard praise like this before, in school, from professors who admired her intellect. But she had also heard the murmurs of doubt, the whispers about her odd behavior, the way she sometimes missed social cues or failed to participate in group discussions in the right way. She knew people noticed these things, even if they didn't say it outright. As they walked through the halls of the firm, passing rows of glass-walled offices where lawyers sat in deep concentration, Eun Kyung couldn't help but wonder what her colleagues would think of her. Would they see her as an equal, or would her differences become a barrier to acceptance? Do Yun led her into a small, private office at the end of the hallway. "This will be your space," he said, opening the door. The office was simple but elegant, with a large desk, shelves lined with law books, and a window overlooking the city. "I hope you find it comfortable. I'll give you some time to settle in, and we'll meet later to discuss your first case assignment." Eun Kyung nodded, stepping inside and setting her briefcase down on the desk. "Thank you, Do-Yun." As he left, closing the door behind him, Eun-kyung took a moment to breathe. The office was quiet, a stark contrast to the bustling energy outside. She sat at her desk, her fingers lightly brushing the surface. This was her space, now a place where she could focus, where she could let her mind work through the intricate puzzles of legal cases. Here, she didn't have to worry about social expectations or fitting in. Here, she could be herself. But the comfort of the office didn't erase the reality of what lay ahead. Outside this room, she would have to navigate the complex world of corporate law, not just in terms of the work, but in terms of the people. She would have to deal with colleagues who might not understand her, who might question her abilities because of her quirks. It was a world where appearances mattered, where confidence and charisma could sometimes carry as much weight as knowledge. Later that afternoon, Eun-kyung was introduced to the rest of the team in a brief meeting. There were polite nods and handshakes, but she could feel the subtle tension in the room. Most of them had already heard about her, how could they not? She was the new junior lawyer with a perfect academic record, but a reputation for being different. One colleague, a woman named Ji-yoon, gave her a tight smile, her eyes quickly scanning Eun-kyung from head to toe as if trying to size her up. "So you're the prodigy everyone's talking about," Ji-yoon said, her tone light, but with an edge that made Eun-kyung uncomfortable. Eun-kyung forced a smile. "I wouldn't say that." "Well," Ji-yoon continued, "we'll see if you can handle the real world outside of textbooks." It was a small comment, but it lingered in the air, a reminder that in this place, Eun-kyung would have to prove herself all over again. Her academic success wouldn't be enough to win over people who were skeptical of her differences. She would have to navigate the unspoken hierarchy of the office, the politics, the social dynamics, all things that had never come naturally to her. As the meeting ended and her colleagues returned to their desks, Eun-kyung felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. This wasn't going to be easy. But then again, nothing in her life had ever been easy. She returned to her office, closing the door behind her and allowing herself a moment of quiet. She took out a small notebook from her bag, a habit she had developed over the years. It was filled with notes, reminders, and little strategies she had come up with to help her navigate social situations. She flipped through the pages, scanning the familiar words of advice she had written to herself. "Stay calm. Focus on the work. Don't let their opinions affect you." She took a deep breath and closed the notebook. She had made it this far. She wasn't going to let a few skeptical colleagues stop her from doing what she had always dreamed of. She was here because she belonged here, whether they believed it or not. Just as she settled back into her chair, her phone buzzed. She picked it up and read the message. "Team dinner tonight at 7 p.m. to celebrate your first day. It's tradition. Looking forward to seeing you there." Eun-kyung's stomach clenched. A social dinner? With the whole team? She hadn't been expecting this. The thought of sitting through hours of conversation, trying to follow the nuances of small talk, the unspoken expectations of bonding, made her chest tighten. She knew that tonight wasn't just about celebrating, it was about being accepted, about proving she could fit in with her new colleagues. But could she? Eun-kyung arrived early on her second day at Hambada Law Firm, eager to get a head start before the office filled with its usual buzz. The night before had been long and exhausting, the social dinner taking more of a toll on her than she had anticipated. Sitting in a restaurant full of unfamiliar faces, trying to follow multiple conversations, and navigating the subtleties of office banter, it had all been overwhelming. She had spent most of the dinner quietly picking at her food, nodding at the right moments, and mentally rehearsing the polite responses she would need to make when someone directed a question her way. The evening had been a reminder that, while she excelled in the structured world of law, the unstructured nature of social interaction still left her feeling lost. Despite the smiles and polite conversation, Eun-kyung could feel the undercurrent of skepticism from her colleagues. They were watching her closely, perhaps waiting to see if the prodigy would trip up, if her reputation could stand up to the pressures of the real world. As she settled into her desk, the familiar hum of her computer booting up offered a small sense of calm. Here, in the quiet of her office, she could focus. The intricacies of legal cases made sense to her. There were rules, logic, and structure. These were the things she could control. But the brief tranquility was soon interrupted by a knock at the door. Eun-kyung looked up to see Ji-yoon standing in the doorway, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Morning," Ji-Eun said, her voice smooth but carrying an edge of something Eun-kyung couldn't quite place. "Settling in?" Eun-kyung nodded, offering a small smile. "Yes, I am." Ji-Eun stepped inside, her gaze briefly sweeping over Eun-kyung's desk, taking in the meticulously organized files and notes. "Good. Do-Yin mentioned you'll be working on a case with us soon." Eun-kyung straightened slightly, the mention of work giving her something solid to hold on to in the conversation. "Yes, I'm looking forward to contributing." Ji-Eun's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let's see how you handle it. Things move quickly here. Real cases are a bit different from law school debates." Eun-kyung sensed the implication behind her words that maybe her academic achievements wouldn't translate into real-world success. She had encountered this attitude before, from people who were quick to doubt her capabilities, especially once they realized she wasn't like them socially. "I'm ready for the challenge," Eun-kyung said, keeping her tone calm, even though the knot of anxiety in her stomach tightened. Ji-Eun lingered for a moment longer, as if assessing her, then gave a short nod. "We'll see," she said before turning and walking out. As the door clicked shut, Eun-kyung let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It was only her second day, but she could already feel the weight of the expectations and the doubts surrounding her. She had hoped that once she started working, her colleagues would see her skills and intellect, and that it would be enough. But she was beginning to realize that it wouldn't be that simple. To them, she was still an unknown, a curiosity. The morning passed slowly, the usual flow of emails and small tasks keeping Eun-kyung busy, but not fully engaged. She knew her first real assignment was coming soon, and she wanted to be prepared. Around midday, she heard another knock on her door, this time more confident and deliberate. When she looked up, Do-Yin was standing there, a relaxed smile on his face. "Busy?" he asked, stepping into her office without waiting for an invitation. Eun-kyung shook her head. "Just catching up on some reading." "Good," he said, sitting down in the chair across from her. "I wanted to talk to you about your first case assignment." Her heart quickened at the mention of the case. She had been waiting for this moment, the chance to prove herself through the work she was best at. "Thank you," she said. "I'm ready." Do-Yin leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before he spoke. "I've heard good things about your academic background. Top of your class, perfect bar exam scores. I know you've got the brains for this job, but you should know that things here aren't just about how much law you know." Eun-kyung nodded, unsure of where he was going with this. "We're a team here at Hambada, and that means working closely with people, reading between the lines, understanding what's said and what's not said. That's just as important as knowing the law. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Eun-kyung paused for a second, feeling the weight of his words. He was hinting at the part of her that she struggled with the most social interaction, navigating the unspoken rules of office dynamics, understanding the subtleties of communication that didn't always follow logic. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady but quieter. "I understand." Do-Yin smiled slightly, as if reading her thoughts. "I'm not saying this to put pressure on you. I just want you to know that I see potential in you. I know it might take some time for you to adjust to the social side of things, but I'm willing to give you that time." His words, though delivered gently, reminded Eun-kyung of what she had always known. Her struggle to fit in wasn't something that could be ignored. But there was something in his tone that made her feel a small sense of relief. He wasn't dismissing her like others might have. He saw her potential, even if he also recognized her challenges. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. "Good," he said, standing up. "Now let's talk about your first case. We got a new client, and I think this will be a good one for you to start with." He handed her a file, and Eun-kyung immediately opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. It was a contract dispute between two large companies, a case that involved intricate details of corporate law. As she read through the initial details, her mind started working, already piecing together potential strategies, arguments, and solutions. "This looks interesting," she said, her voice more confident now. "I thought it might be," Do-Yin said, watching her reaction. "You'll be working with Ji-Eun and another associate on this. It's a big case, so the team is expecting a lot. Make sure to check in with them regularly." Eun-kyung nodded, though the thought of working closely with Ji-Eun made her uneasy. She could already sense the unspoken doubts that Ji-Eun held about her, and now they would be working together. It was going to be another test, one she couldn't afford to fail. "Thank you, Do-Yun," she said as he headed for the door. He paused, turning back to look at her. "Eun-kyung, remember, focus on the law. That's your strength. But don't forget, the people around you matter just as much. Build trust with them. That's how you'll succeed here." With that, he left, and Eun-kyung sat there for a moment, absorbing his words. It was the first time someone in a position of authority had acknowledged her potential, while also recognizing the challenges she faced. It was a strange mix of reassurance and pressure, knowing that she had both an ally and an expectation to meet. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and introductions. Ji-yoon remained cool and distant, her interactions with Eun-kyung polite but perfunctory. It was clear that Ji-yoon didn't trust her yet, and Eun-kyung wasn't sure how to change that. The other associates were more neutral, but she could sense the same hesitancy in their interactions. At one point, during a break, Eun-kyung overheard a conversation between two junior associates in the hallway. They didn't notice her standing nearby as they whispered to each other. "I heard she's some kind of genius," one of them said, a man with glasses and an overly casual posture. "Yeah, but did you see her at the dinner last night?" The other replied. "She barely talked to anyone. It was weird." Eun-kyung felt a sharp pang in her chest. She knew they weren't trying to be cruel, but the words still stung. It was exactly what she had feared, that her social struggles would overshadow her intelligence, that people would see her differences before they saw her capabilities. For the rest of the day, she kept to herself as much as possible, avoiding more interactions than necessary. She had hoped that the work would speak for itself, that her skills would win them over. But she was beginning to realize that being good at her job wouldn't be enough. She would have to find a way to navigate the social currents of the office, to prove not just her intellect but her ability to fit into this world. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her desk, Eun-kyung sat back in her chair, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She knew she could do the work, she had no doubt about that. But the real challenge lay in the people around her, in the unspoken judgments and expectations that followed her every step. And that, she realized, was a battle she wasn't sure how to win. Eun-kyung sat in her office, the light from her desk lamp casting a soft glow over the file in front of her. The name on the case was Kyung-suk, an elderly woman accused of attempting to murder her husband. The details of the case were laid out in a neat summary: the police report, witness statements, and the initial findings from the prosecution. On paper, it seemed like a straightforward case of domestic violence gone too far, but Eun-kyung couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than what was written in the reports. This was her first real defense case since joining Hanbada, and she was well aware of the pressure riding on her shoulders. Do-Yun had personally assigned the case to her, confident in her abilities, but she could sense the tension building around her. Ji-yoon had already made a few passing comments about the challenge of defending someone in a case as sensitive as this. The firm's reputation was on the line, and Eun-kyung knew that her performance would be under intense scrutiny. She flipped through the case file again, her eyes scanning the notes. Kyung-suk had been married for over 40 years. Her husband, Mr. Jang, was in the hospital recovering from severe injuries inflicted during an argument. According to the police report, Kyung-suk had struck him with a heavy object, a cast iron after a heated exchange. The prosecution was painting her as a cold, calculating woman who had snapped under the strain of years of marriage. But something didn't add up for Eun-kyung. There was a hesitation in Kyung-suk's statements, a reluctance to talk about her husband's behavior leading up to the incident. She described the event as an accident, but her words were filled with pauses and uncertainty. Eun-kyung's instincts told her that there was something more behind Kyung-suk's actions, something that hadn't yet been revealed. The day of the first court appearance arrived faster than Eun-kyung had expected. She had prepared extensively, poring over every detail of the case, but the nervous energy was still there, thrumming just beneath the surface. Her hands felt clammy as she straightened her jacket in front of the mirror that morning, mentally rehearsing what she would say in court. Today would be the first time she would stand before a judge and present her case, her first true test as a defense attorney. When she arrived at the courthouse, the weight of the building's imposing architecture pressed down on her. The high ceilings, the polished floors, the distant echo of footsteps, all of it added to the surrealness of the moment. This was real now, no longer just theoretical cases studied in law school. Real people, real lives, real consequences. As Eun Kyung entered the courtroom, she saw Kyung Suk sitting at the defense table, her small, frail frame hunched over. The elderly woman looked exhausted, her face pale and lined with years of worry. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse in her lap, her eyes darting around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. She looked out of place, as if she didn't belong in this cold, sterile environment. Eun Kyung approached the table, offering a soft smile. "Mrs. Kyung Suk, I'm Eun Kyung, your lawyer. How are you feeling today?" Kyung Suk's eyes flickered to Eun Kyung, and for a brief moment, there was a glimmer of hope in them, but it was quickly overshadowed by fear. "I don't know how I ended up here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Eun Kyung nodded, sitting down beside her. "We're gonna figure this out together," she said gently. "I'm here to help you. Just trust me, okay?" Kyung Suk gave a weak nod, but her gaze remained distant, as if she were trapped in a memory she couldn't escape. Eun Kyung's heart ached for her. This wasn't just about a crime. This was about a life, about years of untold stories that had led to this moment. As the courtroom began to fill with people, the atmosphere grew tense. The prosecution, led by a seasoned attorney named Jin-soo, took their place on the other side of the room. Jin-soo was known for his sharp wit and aggressive tactics, and Eun Kyung could feel his eyes on her, appraising her as a newcomer to the courtroom. The judge entered, and the room fell silent as the proceedings began. Eun Kyung's palms felt slick against the papers in front of her, her heart racing as the judge called the case to order. She had always been confident in her knowledge of the law, but now, standing in the middle of a courtroom, all eyes on her, she felt a familiar anxiety creeping in. The prosecution made their opening statement first, painting Kyung Suk as a bitter old woman who had lashed out in anger, attempting to kill her husband in a fit of rage. Jin-soo's words were precise, calculated, designed to sway the judge and jury. He laid out the evidence clearly: Mr. Jang's injuries, the blood-stained iron, the witnesses who had heard shouting from the house that night. Eun Kyung listened intently, jotting down notes, her mind already working through how she would counter each point. But as Jin-soo spoke, she felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. This was real. This was her client's life on the line, and it was up to her to defend it. When it was her turn to speak, Eun Kyung stood, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She took a deep breath, willing the nervous energy to settle. The courtroom was silent, all eyes on her. "Your Honor, members of the court," she began, her voice steady but soft. "The prosecution has laid out a narrative that paints Mrs. Kyung Suk as a violent and dangerous woman. But what they have failed to address is the context of this incident. Mrs. Kyung Suk has spent years in a marriage filled with turmoil, and what happened that night was not a premeditated act of violence. It was the result of years of emotional and psychological strain, and we intend to show that she acted in self-defense." Her voice faltered slightly as she spoke, the pressure of the room weighing heavily on her. She could feel her hands trembling as she held the papers in front of her, her mind racing through the arguments she had prepared. But as she continued, something shifted. The logic of the case, the facts, and the law, these were her anchors. She focused on those, letting her mind latch onto the familiar structure of legal arguments. "We asked the court to consider not just the events of that one night, but the years that led up to it," Eun Kyung said, her voice gaining strength. "This is not a simple case of an argument that got out of hand. There are deeper issues at play here, and we will be presenting evidence to support that Mrs. Kyung Suk's actions were driven by fear, not anger." When she finished her opening remarks, she sat down, her heart still pounding in her chest. She knew it hadn't been perfect. There were moments where her anxiety had crept in, causing her to stumble over her words, but she had made it through. She had laid the foundation for the defense, and now the real work would begin. As the prosecution began calling their witnesses, Eun Kyung sat beside Kyung Suk, listening carefully, taking notes, and planning her cross-examinations. But all the while, the weight of the trial hung over her. This was just the beginning, and already she could feel the toll it was taking on her. During a recess, Eun Kyung stepped outside for a moment to gather her thoughts. The air was crisp, a welcome relief from the tension inside the courtroom. She stood alone in the courtyard, letting the cool breeze wash over her. She knew she had a long road ahead. Defending Kyung-suk wouldn't be easy, especially with Jin-soo leading the prosecution. But as she stood there, staring up at the imposing courthouse, she reminded herself why she had taken this case in the first place. Kyung-suk wasn't just another client. She was a woman who had been pushed to the edge, and it was Eun Kyung's job to make sure her story was heard. For the first time in her career, Eun Kyung felt the true weight of being a defense attorney. This wasn't about winning or losing, it was about justice. And she wasn't going to back down. As the recess ended, and Eun Kyung walked back into the courtroom, her mind was clear. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to let her nerves get in the way. She owed it to Kyung-suk and to herself to see this through. The trial had only just begun, but Eun Kyung was ready for the fight ahead. Eun Kyung sat at her desk in the quiet of her office. The case file of Kyung-suk spread out before her like pieces of an unsolved puzzle. The courtroom had been tense, and the prosecution's case was strong on the surface. But something in Kyung-suk's demeanor had been troubling Eun Kyung since their first meeting. There was fear, deep and rooted, in the way the elderly woman spoke about her life. Yet she had been reluctant to discuss her husband in detail, always deflecting when the conversation touched on him. Eun Kyung had learned to trust her instincts, and they were telling her that there was more to this story. She needed to dig deeper into Kyung-suk's past if she was going to build a defense that would convince the court to see the situation for what it really was. The pieces she had didn't fit the narrative of a cold-blooded attempted murder. Something was missing, and she was determined to find it. The first thing Eun Kyung did was request the police reports on domestic disturbances from Kyung-suk's neighborhood. Her gut told her that this wasn't the first time violence had entered that household, and she needed a record to back up that suspicion. When the reports arrived later that week, her suspicions were confirmed. There were multiple incidents spanning the last 2 decades, each one quickly dismissed or handled quietly by Kyung-suk's husband, Mr. Jang. Some neighbors had called the police after hearing yelling late at night, while others reported seeing Kyung-suk with bruises or walking with a limp. But whenever the police were called, Mr. Jang had smoothed things over. He claimed that Kyung-suk was clumsy, that she often tripped or hurt herself while doing household chores. The police had accepted his explanations without much scrutiny. The reports painted a clear picture of a woman who had been isolated, silenced, and forced to live under the oppressive control of a man who knew how to manipulate both his wife and the system. Eun Kyung's heart sank as she read the accounts. This was no simple argument that escalated out of control. This was a woman who had endured years, perhaps decades of abuse. Now that she had confirmation, Eun Kyung began to gather more evidence. She needed to prove that Kyung-suk had been trapped in a cycle of violence, that the night she had struck her husband wasn't an act of malice, but one of desperate self-defense. If the court could understand the psychological toll of that abuse, there was a chance she could argue for delayed legitimate defense, delayed self-defense, a legal strategy often used in cases where victims of long-term abuse react violently after years of repression. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. The law, while allowing for self-defense, often required immediate danger to justify violent actions. But Eun Kyung believed that Kyung-suk's situation was unique. Years of living in fear, enduring physical and emotional abuse, could lead a person to react in ways that didn't fit into the neat categories of law. She needed to make the court understand that the constant threat of harm could create an ongoing state of danger in the mind of a victim, where the lines between immediate and delayed response were blurred. Her next step was to interview people who had known the couple. Eun Kyung visited Kyung-suk's neighborhood, speaking with old friends, neighbors, and even distant relatives. She listened to stories of a once lively and independent woman who had gradually become a shadow of herself, rarely seen outside the house, always deferential to her husband. One neighbor, an elderly woman who had lived next door to them for over 30 years, shared a particularly haunting story. "I remember the first time I heard them arguing," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "It must have been 20 years ago. I thought it was just a normal couple's fight, but it kept happening. Every few weeks, there'd be yelling, and then silence for days. I saw her one morning, after a bad night. Her face was swollen, and her arm was in a sling. She said she had slipped while cleaning, but I didn't believe her. None of us did." The more Eun Kyung listened, the more she realized how deep the abuse ran. Kyung-suk's husband had controlled her life in every way: financially, emotionally and physically. He had isolated her from friends, manipulated her into staying silent, and ensured that any attempts to leave or get help were met with more violence. Armed with this new understanding, Eun Kyung sat down with Kyung Suk again. This time, she needed the elderly woman to open up fully about what had happened in her marriage. It wasn't just about building the case anymore. Eun Kyung needed Kyung Suk to know that she was believed, that her suffering hadn't gone unnoticed. They met in a quiet room at Hambada, away from the noise of the office. Kyung Suk sat across from Eun Kyung, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face was drawn, her eyes downcast, as if she had spent years learning to make herself as invisible as possible. "Mrs. Kyung Suk," Eun Kyung began, her voice soft but firm, "I've spoken to some of your neighbors. I know about the abuse. I know what you've been living through." Kyung Suk's shoulders tensed, her eyes flickering up for a moment before dropping again. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to hide it anymore," Eun Kyung said gently. "I've seen the police reports, the accounts from your neighbors. They've told me about the bruises, the yelling, the times you've been hurt. You don't have to protect him anymore. He can't hurt you now." There was a long silence, the weight of Eun Kyung's words hanging in the air. For a moment, Eun Kyung thought Kyung Suk might not respond, might retreat further into herself. But then, slowly, she began to speak. "It wasn't always like this," she said, her voice trembling. "When we first got married, he was kind, loving even. But over time, things changed. He started drinking more, started getting angry over small things. At first, it was just shouting. Then he began hitting me. I thought it would stop, that it was just a phase, but it never did. It only got worse." Eun Kyung listened carefully, not interrupting, letting Kyung Suk's story unfold at its own pace. "I didn't have anywhere to go," Kyung Suk continued. "He controlled all the money. He made sure I was dependent on him for everything. And whenever I tried to leave, he would find me. He always found me." Tears welled in Kyung Suk's eyes, and she wiped them away quickly, as if ashamed to show any emotion. "That night," she whispered, "I didn't mean to hurt him. I couldn't take it anymore. I was so afraid. He was coming at me again, and I grabbed the iron. I don't even remember hitting him. I just wanted him to stop." Eun Kyung's heart ached for her client. This was exactly what she had suspected. Kyung Suk hadn't acted out of malice or premeditation. She had acted out of fear, out of a desperate need to protect herself after years of living under constant threat. "Mrs. Kyung Suk," Eun Kyung said softly, "we're going to use this. I'm going to make sure the court understands what you've been through. We're going to argue that you acted in self-defense, that you were living in a constant state of fear, and that your actions were a result of the years of abuse you endured." Kyung Suk looked at her, a mixture of hope and disbelief in her eyes. "Do you think they'll believe me?" "I'll make sure they do," Eun Kyung said firmly. With this new information, Eun Kyung knew she had the foundation for her defense. She would build the case around delayed legitimate defense, delayed self-defense. It would be difficult, as the concept wasn't always easy for courts to grasp, especially when there wasn't an immediate threat at the moment of the attack. But Eun Kyung believed in Kyung Suk's story, and she was determined to make the court see that this wasn't just an act of violence. It was the culmination of years of terror, of a life lived in the shadow of abuse. The next few weeks were spent gathering evidence, compiling testimonies, and preparing expert witnesses. Eun Kyung brought in a psychologist who specialized in trauma and abuse to testify about the psychological impact of long-term domestic violence. She spoke with more neighbors, building a timeline of the abuse that spanned decades. Each new piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of the hell that Kyung Suk had been living through. As the trial date approached, Eun Kyung felt a quiet sense of resolve. She knew this case was going to be a fight. The prosecution was still pushing for a harsh sentence, painting Kyung Suk as a violent offender who had acted out of spite. But Eun Kyung was ready. She had the truth on her side, and she wasn't going to back down. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. It was about giving Kyung Suk her voice back, about showing the world that she wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was a survivor, and it was time her story was told. The day of the first hearing had arrived, and Eun Kyung stood outside the courthouse, staring at the imposing stone structure with a mix of determination and anxiety. She had prepared meticulously for this moment, going over every detail of the case, every potential argument the prosecution might throw at her. But no amount of preparation could quiet the nerves twisting in her stomach. This wasn't just about defending Kyung-suk anymore. It was about proving to herself, and to everyone else, that she could handle the pressure of the courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and cold, the distant murmurs of legal professionals echoing through the grand hall. Eun-kyung walked down the long corridor leading to the courtroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. The polished floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the sound of her heels clicking against the marble only added to the growing tension. This was her moment. Her first major defense case in front of a courtroom full of people, all waiting to see how she would perform. As she entered the courtroom, her eyes were immediately drawn to the defense table, where Kyung-suk sat, her frail figure hunched forward as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. She looked so small, so vulnerable. Seeing her like that only deepened Eun-kyung's resolve. This woman had been through hell, and it was up to Eun-kyung to make sure the court saw the truth behind her actions. The courtroom slowly filled with spectators, lawyers, and family members. On the other side of the room, the prosecution team was already settled in, led by Jin-soo, the confident and seasoned attorney who had been a thorn in Eun-kyung's side since the beginning. His reputation for aggressive tactics and his ability to sway juries with charisma made him a formidable opponent. He looked completely at ease, a stark contrast to the nervous energy coursing through Eun-kyung. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Eun-kyung could feel the weight of every gaze upon her as the hearing began. The prosecution wasted no time, calling their first witness a police officer who had responded to the scene of the crime the night Kyung-suk struck her husband. His testimony was clinical and precise, detailing the blood, the injuries, the iron that had been used as a weapon. As the officer spoke, Jin-soo walked slowly around the courtroom, pausing occasionally to glance at Eun-kyung, as if daring her to challenge his case. It was intimidating. Every word the prosecution said seemed to paint Kyung-suk in a harsher light, reducing the complexities of her life to one moment of violence. Eun-kyung sat still, her pen resting on the pad in front of her. She could feel the familiar tightness in her chest, the anxiety that always surfaced when she was expected to speak in front of others. Her mind was racing, going over every detail of the case, every argument she had prepared. But when it came time to stand and cross-examine the officer, the weight of the courtroom seemed to close in on her. She rose from her chair, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. Her hand gripped the side of the table as she approached the witness stand, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the eyes of the jury, the judge, and the spectators all trained on her, waiting to see how she would handle this. "Officer," she began, her voice soft and hesitant. "You mentioned that there were signs of struggle at the scene. Can you clarify what you mean by that?" The officer shifted in his seat. There were overturned objects in the living room, as well as blood on the floor near the chair where the husband was found. It was clear there had been a physical altercation. Eun-kyung nodded, her mind working to piece together the information. She knew she had to establish that Kyung-suk hadn't acted out of cold-blooded violence, but out of fear and self-defense. Her voice wavered slightly as she spoke again. "And did you speak to Mrs. Kyung-suk at the scene?" she asked, her eyes flicking up to meet the officer's. "I did," the officer replied. She was in shock, unresponsive at first. She didn't say much beyond admitting that she had hit her husband with the iron. Eun-kyung felt the pressure of the room growing, her nerves creeping up again. She hesitated, her mind blank for a moment, the anxiety clawing at her throat. She could sense Jin-soo watching her, waiting for her to stumble. But then she remembered what she had discovered during her investigation, the years of abuse, the countless times Kyung-suk had suffered in silence. She reminded herself that this wasn't just about legal arguments. This was about justice. Taking a deep breath, Eun-kyung steadied her voice. "Officer, in your report, you mentioned that there had been previous calls to the residence for domestic disturbances. Is that correct?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, there were a few calls over the years. Neighbors reported yelling, but the husband always explained it away as accidents or misunderstandings." "And did anyone ever investigate those incidents further?" Eun-kyung pressed, her confidence slowly building. Was there ever an attempt to speak with Mrs. Kyung-suk directly, to understand if she was in danger? The officer hesitated. No, we didn't investigate beyond the initial reports. The husband seemed convincing in his explanations. Eun Kyung paused, letting the silence settle over the courtroom for a moment before continuing. So, despite multiple reports of domestic disturbances, no one ever looked into the possibility that Mrs. Kyung-suk might have been living in fear for her life? The officer's discomfort was evident now. No, we didn't. Eun Kyung nodded, her tone firm. Thank you, officer. As she returned to her seat, Eun Kyung could feel the shift in the room. The jury was beginning to see the cracks in the prosecution's narrative, the possibility that there was more to this story than a simple act of violence. She had made her first real step in establishing the history of abuse, and that gave her the momentum she needed. But as the day went on, the challenges continued. Every time she stood to speak, that familiar anxiety would bubble up, threatening to take over. She struggled to find her voice at times, hesitating between questions, her words sometimes stumbling over each other. Jin-soo didn't make it easier. He was quick to object, quick to challenge her, and his confident manner only heightened her nervousness. Yet, despite her moments of uncertainty, there was something that kept her grounded. Whenever she started to feel overwhelmed, she would glance at Kyung-suk, sitting quietly at the defense table, her hands trembling in her lap. She wasn't just a client, she was a woman whose life had been torn apart by years of abuse, a woman who had finally fought back after years of suffering. It was that thought that pushed Eun Kyung forward. By the end of the day, Eun Kyung had cross-examined 2 witnesses, each time revealing small but significant details that hinted at the abusive environment Kyung-suk had been trapped in. The prosecution's case, while still strong, wasn't as airtight as it had seemed at first. And though her voice had faltered more than once, Eun Kyung had managed to present a defense that was beginning to take shape. As the court adjourned for the day, Eun Kyung felt a mix of exhaustion and relief wash over her. She had survived her first day in court, and though it hadn't been perfect, she had made progress. The judge had listened, the jury had paid attention, and, most importantly, she hadn't backed down. As she gathered her notes, she felt a presence behind her. It was Jin-soo, his expression unreadable. "You did better than I expected," he said, his voice low. For a first-timer, Eun Kyung straightened, meeting his gaze. "Thank you." Jin-soo smirked. "But don't get too comfortable. This is just the beginning." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Eun Kyung standing alone in the emptying courtroom. His words hung in the air, a reminder of the challenges yet to come. But for the first time since the trial had started, she didn't feel intimidated. She felt something else. She felt ready. Eun Kyung walked into the courtroom on the 3rd day of the trial with a new sense of determination. The first few days had been difficult. Her nerves had gotten the best of her more than once, and the aggressive prosecution led by Jin-soo had made things even more challenging. But she had survived the initial hurdles. Each night, she went over her performance, analyzing her strengths and weaknesses, adjusting her strategy. And now, she was ready to fully execute the defense she had carefully crafted. Her focus was on delayed legitimate defense, delayed self-defense. It was a challenging legal concept, one not commonly understood or easily accepted by the courts. The idea was that a victim of prolonged abuse might not react immediately to a threat, but their response, even if delayed, was still an act of self-preservation. It wasn't an easy argument to make, especially in a case like this, where there wasn't a clear, immediate danger the night Kyung-suk had struck her husband. But Eun Kyung was confident that she could convince the court that Kyung-suk's actions had been driven by years of fear and torment. As the trial resumed, the courtroom was already filled with a quiet tension. Journalists had started to take interest in the case, drawn by the dramatic story of an elderly woman accused of attempted murder and the history of domestic abuse that Eun Kyung had begun to reveal. There were whispers of curiosity and doubt among the spectators. Could a case like this truly end with a favorable verdict for the defendant? Kyung-suk sat quietly at the defense table, her hands folded in her lap. She looked more fragile today, as if the weight of reliving her trauma in front of strangers had finally caught up to her. Eun Kyung sat beside her, offering a small, reassuring smile before turning her attention to the task ahead. Today, they would begin presenting their case. The first witness Eun Kyung called to the stand was Dr. Kwon, a clinical psychologist who specialized in trauma and domestic abuse. Dr. Kwon had met with Kyung-suk several times in the weeks leading up to the trial and had provided an in-depth assessment of the psychological toll that years of abuse had taken on her. His testimony was crucial in laying the groundwork for the defense. Dr. Kwon took the stand and was sworn in. Eun Kyung stood and approached the witness stand, her movements more deliberate and assured than they had been in the earlier days of the trial. She knew this testimony could make or break the case. Dr. Kwon, she began, her voice steady, "You've met with Mrs. Kyung-suk on several occasions. Could you describe for the court the impact that prolonged domestic abuse can have on a person's mental and emotional state?" Dr. Kwon nodded, his expression serious. Prolonged domestic abuse can have devastating effects on a person's psyche. Victims often experience a range of emotions, including fear, shame, and hopelessness. Over time, they may develop a sense of learned helplessness, where they feel that no matter what they do, they cannot escape the abuse. This can lead to a state of constant psychological distress, where the victim feels trapped, both mentally and physically. And in Mrs. Kyung-suk's case, Eun Kyung asked, her gaze never leaving Dr. Kwon. In Mrs. Kyung-suk's case, Dr. Kwon continued, she endured decades of physical, emotional, and psychological abuse. Based on my evaluations, she developed a form of trauma response in which her ability to perceive danger was heightened. Even when her husband wasn't physically attacking her in the moment, the threat of violence was ever present in her mind. This creates a constant state of fear and hypervigilance, where the victim feels that an attack could happen at any moment. Eun Kyung nodded, letting Dr. Kwon's words sink into the courtroom. She knew the jurors were listening closely. In your professional opinion, could this state of fear have influenced Mrs. Kyung-suk's actions the night she struck her husband? Absolutely, Dr. Kwon replied firmly. Mrs. Kyung-suk's response was not an isolated incident of violence. It was the result of years of cumulative abuse. Her decision to strike her husband wasn't premeditated or out of malice. It was an act of survival, brought on by years of living in constant fear. There was a murmur in the courtroom as Dr. Kwon finished his statement. The prosecution shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jean Su's face remained impassive, but Eun Kyung could sense that her argument was beginning to land. She proceeded with her questions, leading Dr. Kwon to explain how victims of prolonged abuse often reach a breaking point where their actions may seem disproportionate, but are, in fact, the result of the years of trauma they have endured. It wasn't about the immediate moment of the altercation, it was about the years of suffering that led up to it. After Dr. Kwon's testimony, Eun Kyung felt a quiet sense of triumph. The jury had been attentive. The judge had allowed the full discussion of delayed, legitimate defense, and she had successfully laid the foundation for her argument. Now, it was time to bring in witnesses who could further corroborate the abuse. The next person Eun Kyung called to the stand was Min Ji, one of Kyung-suk's old friends, and one of the few people who had been aware of the abuse over the years. Min Ji was a key witness, someone who could provide a personal account of the relationship between Kyung-suk and her husband. Min Ji, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, took the stand nervously. She had been hesitant to testify, worried about reliving her friend's trauma in public, but Eun Kyung had convinced her that it was necessary. Min Ji, Eun Kyung began gently, can you tell the court about your relationship with Mrs. Kyung-suk? We've known each other for more than 30 years, Min Ji said softly. We used to live in the same neighborhood when we were younger. We were close like sisters. And during that time, did Mrs. Kyung-suk ever confide in you about her marriage? Min Ji hesitated, her eyes glancing toward Kyung-suk, who sat at the defense table, her head lowered. Yes, she said finally. She told me about how things started to change after a few years of marriage. Her husband became controlling. He wouldn't let her leave the house without his permission. He monitored everything she did. Eun Kyung nodded, encouraging her to continue. Did she ever mention physical abuse? Min Ji's voice trembled slightly. Yes, she would never go into detail, but there were times when she would show up at my door with bruises. She'd always say she had fallen or that it was an accident, but I knew better. I could see it in her eyes. She was scared. The courtroom was silent, the weight of Min Ji's words hanging in the air. Eun Kyung could see members of the jury shifting in their seats, clearly affected by the testimony. "And did Mrs. Kyung-suk ever try to leave her husband?" Eun Kyung asked. Min-ji nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, she tried. She came to me one night, years ago, after he'd beaten her. She was ready to leave. But he found her. He always found her. She said there was no escaping him." Eun Kyung allowed a pause, letting the gravity of the situation settle. Then she asked the most important question. "In your opinion, Min-ji, do you believe Mrs. Kyung-suk lived in constant fear of her husband?" "Yes," Min-ji said, her voice cracking. "She was terrified of him. Every day." The testimony hit its mark. The jurors were visibly moved, some glancing toward Kyung-suk with a new sense of sympathy. Eun Kyung knew this was the turning point she had been working toward. She was slowly but surely building the case that Kyung-suk had acted out of survival, not aggression. As the days went on, Eun Kyung's confidence grew. Each time she stood to speak, she felt more in control, more assured in her arguments. The initial anxiety that had plagued her during the first days of the trial had begun to dissipate, replaced by a quiet resolve. She knew this case inside and out, and she was beginning to believe that she could win it. Jin-soo, ever the formidable opponent, continued to push back. He challenged every witness, objected frequently, and tried to undermine the defense's narrative at every turn. But Eun Kyung held her ground. With each cross-examination, she grew sharper, more precise. She began to sense when Jin-soo was leading a witness in a certain direction and countered him with well-timed objections and strategic questioning. The turning point came when Eun Kyung presented the argument for delayed legitimate defense. She stood before the jury, her voice steady and clear. "Members of the jury, the prosecution would have you believe that Mrs. Kyung-suk acted out of anger, that her actions were cold and calculated. But what they fail to acknowledge is the years of abuse that led up to that night. The law recognizes that self-defense doesn't always occur in the heat of the moment. There are cases like this one, where the threat is ever present, where the danger never truly goes away. Mrs. Kyung-suk acted out of a need to protect herself, after years of suffering in silence. She didn't plan this. She didn't want this. She was a victim of circumstance, and her actions were those of a woman who had finally reached her breaking point." As she spoke, Eun Kyung could feel the shift in the room. The jury was listening. The judge was watching closely. For the first time since the trial began, she felt the momentum swing in her favor. Eun Kyung sat down, her heart still racing from the adrenaline, but with a sense of calm. She had done what she needed to do. Now, it was up to the court to decide. But one thing was clear. She had proven that she belonged in this courtroom, and more importantly, she had proven that Kyung-suk's story deserved to be heard. The courtroom was filled with a heavy, almost tangible tension as the jury filed back in, their expressions unreadable. Eun Kyung sat at the defense table, her hands clasped together tightly, her palms damp with sweat. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she glanced at Kyung-suk, who sat beside her with the same frail, weary expression she had carried throughout the trial. There was a certain calmness in the old woman now, a kind of acceptance, as if she had made peace with whatever was about to happen. But for Eun Kyung, everything still hung in the balance. This was at the moment that would decide Kyung-suk's fate. The courtroom had been an exhausting battleground, and both sides had fought fiercely. Jin-soo had made every effort to paint Kyung-suk as a violent woman who had snapped and attempted to murder her husband in cold blood. But Eun Kyung had carefully dismantled his case, piece by piece. She had presented the years of abuse, the fear that had driven Kyung-suk to act, and the psychological toll that had worn her down over decades. Now it was all up to the jury. The judge cleared his throat, his deep voice breaking the silence. As the jury reached a verdict, a middle-aged man in the front row of the jury stood, holding the small slip of paper that held Kyung-suk's future in its folds. The room seemed to shrink as everyone held their breath. "We have, Your Honor," the man said, his voice steady but quiet. The judge nodded. "Please deliver the verdict." The man unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning it quickly before he spoke. "In the case of the state versus Kyung-suk, on the charge of attempted murder, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." The words hung in the air for a moment, as if the courtroom itself had to catch up to what had just been said. Then, slowly, the reality of it settled in. Eun Kyung exhaled a breath, she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her body sagging with relief. She had done it. They had won. Kyung-suk had been absolved of all charges. Beside her, Kyung-suk sat frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white. For a moment, it seemed like she couldn't process what had just happened, as if her mind had been so prepared for the worst that it couldn't accept the sudden turn of events. "Mrs. Kyung-suk," Eun-kyung whispered, leaning toward her gently, "You're free." Kyung-suk blinked, her eyes filling with tears. Slowly, she turned to Eun-kyung, her voice barely audible. I don't understand. I didn't think." Eun-kyung gave her a reassuring smile, her own eyes wet with emotion. "You're free, Mrs. Kyung-suk. It's over." The weight of those words finally seemed to sink in, and Kyung-suk let out a small, broken sob, her hands coming up to cover her face. The years of pain, fear, and hopelessness that had defined her life seemed to crash down all at once. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she let herself cry not out of fear, but out of relief. Eun-kyung placed a hand on Kyung-suk's shoulder, offering her a moment of quiet comfort as the courtroom erupted in emotion around them. The press, seated in the back of the room, began whispering furiously among themselves, while Jin-soo stood across the room, his face tight with controlled disappointment. He had fought hard, but even he knew when he had been outmaneuvered. He caught Eun-kyung's eye for a brief second, offering her a curt nod of acknowledgement before turning away. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order in the courtroom as he dismissed the jury and officially brought the trial to a close. As people began filing out of the room, Eun-kyung helped Kyung-suk to her feet. The old woman was still shaking, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just happened, but there was a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. She was free. As they stepped out into the sunlight, the warmth of the day wrapped around them, a sharp contrast to the cold tension of the courtroom. Kyung-suk looked up at the sky, her face bathed in light, and for the first time in years, she smiled. "I never thought I'd see the outside like this again," she murmured, her voice filled with quiet wonder. "I never thought I'd feel free." "You deserve this," Eun-kyung said softly, standing beside her. "You've been through enough. Now it's time for you to start over." Kyung-suk turned to her, her eyes still wet with tears. "Thank you. I don't know how to thank you enough. You saved my life." Eun-kyung smiled, feeling the warmth of Kyung-suk's words settle deep in her chest. "You don't need to thank me. You survived. That's what matters." As Kyung-suk was escorted away by her family, Eun-kyung stood alone for a moment, letting the victory wash over her. It had been a long, exhausting battle, but she had done what she had set out to do. She had given Kyung-suk her life back. But as the adrenaline of the trial began to fade, Eun-kyung couldn't ignore the quiet anxiety that still lingered. This was just one victory in a world that was still full of challenges. Her mind began to drift back to the law firm, to the cold stares and whispered judgments from her colleagues. She had won the case, but had she won their respect? Back at Hambada Law Firm, the atmosphere was different. As Eun-kyung walked through the familiar halls, she could feel the shift. There was no denying that her colleagues were watching her differently now. Ji-eun, who had always been distant and skeptical of Eun-kyung's abilities, passed by with a brief nod of acknowledgement, her usual coolness replaced with a hint of something resembling respect. As Eun-kyung reached her office, she found Do-yeon waiting for her at her door. His arms were crossed, but there was a smile on his face, a genuine one. "Well done," he said, his voice full of admiration. "I heard the news. You handled yourself brilliantly in court." Eun-kyung felt a small flush of pride at his words. "Thank you. It was difficult." Do-yeon nodded. "I expected nothing less. You were up against Jin-soo, and you held your ground. That's no small feat." For a moment, there was a pause, a quiet understanding between them. Do-yeon had always believed in her potential, but now, it seemed like he truly saw her as an equal. There was no more hesitation in his praise, no more hint of doubt. "I think you've earned yourself a break," Do-yeon said, smiling. "Take some time to rest. You've more than proven yourself." Eun-kyung returned the smile, though there was still a part of her that couldn't quite relax. She had proven herself, yes, but only in the courtroom. The real battle for acceptance, for belonging, was still ongoing. She could feel it in the way her colleagues interacted with her, polite, but still distant, still unsure how to approach her outside the realm of law. As Duyun left, Eun Kyung sat down at her desk, the familiar quiet of her office wrapping around her. She had won the case, gained the respect of her boss, and started to shift the perception of her abilities among her peers. But the challenge of navigating the social complexities of the office remained. She took a deep breath, leaning back in her chair. This victory was important, but it wasn't the end. There would be more cases, more battles to fight, both in and out of the courtroom. But for now, she allowed herself a small moment of peace. She had defended her client. She had won. And for the first time since joining Hambada, she felt like she truly belonged there. Even if the road ahead was still uncertain, she was ready to face it one step at a time. After the victory in Kyung-suk's case, the days passed in a blur of congratulations and whispered acknowledgments from her colleagues. Yet, despite the growing respect she had earned, Eun Kyung couldn't shake the lingering feeling of isolation that followed her everywhere she went. Even now, with the weight of her first major case lifted from her shoulders, she found it hard to truly relax. The social dynamics of Hambada law firm, the unspoken rules of interaction, and the constant pressure to fit and still gnawed at her, leaving her restless. That evening, as she returned to her small apartment, the familiar quiet settled over her like a blanket. The walls were lined with shelves of law books and meticulously organized files. Everything in her life was neat, structured, controlled, but the silence only amplified the thoughts that constantly swirled in her mind. She had won the case. She had proven her abilities. So, why did she still feel so disconnected? Eun Kyung sat at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea as her phone buzzed beside her. It was her father. His timing, as always, was impeccable. She answered the call, her voice soft but warm. "Hi, Appa," she said. "Eun Kyung." Her father's voice came through with a familiar tone of pride. "I heard about the case. You did it, didn't you?" She smiled, though her heart felt heavy. "Yes, we won. Kyung-suk was absolved. I knew you would do it," he said, his voice brimming with confidence. "I never doubted you for a second. You've always had the mind of a lawyer. Even as a child, you were different. So smart, so focused." The warmth in his voice brought back a flood of memories, and Eun Kyung felt herself drifting into the past. She had always been different from the other children, but her father had never treated her like an outsider. He had always seen her intelligence, her potential, even when others only saw her social awkwardness or inability to connect in the same way as her peers. As a child, Eun Kyung had spent hours reading legal texts and studying complex problems, all while other children played outside. Her father had encouraged her every step of the way, providing her with the resources and support she needed to excel. She remembered sitting at the kitchen table with him, the two of them poring over case law and legal theories long before she had even entered law school. It was their way of bonding, their shared world of logic and reason. But even then, there had been moments of doubt. She had struggled to make friends, to understand the intricate social webs that other children seemed to navigate so easily. There were times when she felt isolated, even lonely, but her father had always been there to reassure her. "You don't need to be like everyone else," he had said to her once, when she had come home in tears after a particularly difficult day at school. "You're special, Eun Kyung. Your mind is your strength. Don't ever let anyone make you feel less because you don't fit into their world." His words had carried her through so many challenges, but now, sitting in her quiet apartment after such a significant victory, she found herself questioning whether they still applied. She had won the case, yes, but she still felt like an outsider at Hambada. No matter how hard she tried, the social world of the office eluded her. She couldn't joke with colleagues the way they joked with each other, couldn't easily navigate the office politics, or form the effortless bonds that seemed to come naturally to others. "Are you okay, Eun Kyung?" her father asked, sensing the change in her tone. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. "It's just, I don't know. I thought winning this case would feel different, like maybe it would change things, but I still feel like I don't belong." Her father was silent for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "Eun Kyung, you've always belonged. Whether they see it or not, that's on them, not on you. You're there because of your abilities, because of your mind, Don't let their opinions or their social games get to you. I know, she whispered, though the words didn't quite bring the comfort they once had. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that her abilities were enough, that her success would eventually lead to acceptance. But the weight of her social struggles hung over her like a cloud. I'm proud of you, Eun Kyung, her father said, his voice firm but gentle. No matter what, you've come so far, and I know you'll keep going, no matter the challenges. After they hung up, Eun Kyung sat for a while, staring at the screen of her phone. The conversation had brought a sense of warmth, a reminder of the deep bond she shared with her father. He had always been her biggest supporter, the one person who had never made her feel less for her differences. But as much as she cherished his belief in her, she couldn't help but feel the growing distance between how he saw her and how she saw herself in the world of Hambada. The next day at the office, the shift in dynamics was palpable. The victory in court had certainly changed the way her colleagues looked at her, but it hadn't bridged the gap she felt between them. They respected her now, yes, but respect was not the same as connection. She could feel it in the brief, polite nods from Ji-eun and the formal congratulations from others. They acknowledged her competence, her skills, but she still felt like she was standing on the outside, looking in. There were moments in the office where she would walk by a group of colleagues chatting and laughing, and though they would greet her with a smile, the conversation would slow, almost stalling as she passed by. It wasn't intentional, she knew that. They weren't being rude or unkind, but the ease with which they interacted with each other, the shared jokes, the unspoken understanding was something she couldn't tap into. In the quiet of her office, Eun Kyung focused on her work, diving into the next case with her usual meticulous attention to detail. Here, in the world of legal strategy and logical argumentation, she felt at home. The law was her refuge, the one place where everything made sense. But outside the walls of her office, in the hallways and break rooms, she felt the weight of her social isolation pressing down on her. Eun Kyung often found herself replaying the social interactions in her head, analyzing them for what she might have missed. She had always done this, even as a child. Conversations were like puzzles, and she would go over them again and again, trying to understand where she had failed to connect. But no matter how much she analyzed, the answers never seemed clear. Social cues, body language, tone, these things eluded her in a way that legal principles never did. At times, she wished she could simply turn it off, to stop caring about the distance between her and her colleagues. She had her father's words echoing in her mind, you don't need to be like everyone else, but in the world of Hambada, fitting in wasn't just about wanting to belong. It was about survival, building relationships, forming alliances, being seen as part of the team. These things mattered, whether she liked it or not. Yet, as the days passed, Eun Kyung couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how many cases she won, no matter how brilliant her legal mind, there would always be something that kept her apart. It was a quiet, internal battle, one she didn't know how to fight. She had her father's belief in her, and that had carried her through so much. But now, in the quiet of her own thoughts, Eun Kyung wondered if that would be enough. Maybe winning cases wasn't the hard part. Maybe the real challenge was finding a way to navigate a world where she would always be different. Eun Kyung sat in her office at Hambada law firm, the faint sounds of conversation and tapping keyboards drifting through the hallway outside. She had just finished reviewing the details of her latest case, one that already felt heavier than anything she had encountered before. This time, she wasn't defending someone like Kyung Suk, a woman whose story of abuse had slowly unfolded with each layer of discovery. This case was different, more complex, and potentially more devastating. Her new client was Ji Min-jun, a 78-year-old man living in a nursing home, accused of stabbing his roommate during a violent outburst. The charges were severe attempted murder, and if convicted, Min-jun would spend the remainder of his life in prison. But what made the case particularly difficult wasn't just the crime itself. It was the fact that Min-jun suffered from dementia. As Eun Kyung flipped through the initial reports, she could see that the prosecution was already building a case against Min-jun, framing him as a danger to society. His violent outburst had resulted in his roommate sustaining serious injuries, and the nursing home staff had been quick to call the police. There were witness statements describing the chaos of that night, the shouting, the confusion, the fear that had spread through the home's quiet halls. It all pointed to a man who had lost control, But as Eun Kyung read through the medical reports, it became clear that Min Jun's condition played a significant role in the incident. Dementia, especially in its later stages, could cause severe mood swings, confusion, and even violent behavior. This wasn't the calculated act of a man who had intended to harm someone. This was the tragic consequence of a deteriorating mind, a mind that no longer understood the world around it. Eun Kyung felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her as she leaned back in her chair, staring at the stack of files. Defending someone like Min Jun wouldn't be easy. The court wouldn't be swayed by emotions alone. She would need to build a solid legal defense that accounted for his medical condition, one that could explain how dementia had turned him into a man he no longer recognized. The first step, she knew, would be understanding Min Jun's condition in greater detail. Dementia was a broad diagnosis, and its effects varied widely from person to person. Eun Kyung needed to understand the specifics of Min Jun's case, the type of dementia he had, how advanced it was, and how it might have affected his behavior on the night of the incident. She needed to know if there were any prior signs of aggression or confusion that had gone unnoticed by the nursing home staff. This wasn't just about presenting him as a victim of his illness. It was about showing that his actions were driven by a disease, not intent. She picked up her phone and made a call to Dr. Seo, a geriatric specialist who had been treating Min Jun for the past few years. Dr. Seo had provided the initial medical reports, but Eun Kyung needed more than just written statements. She needed to speak to him directly to get a deeper understanding of what Min Jun's daily life was like and how his dementia had progressed over time. Dr. Seo, Eun Kyung began when he answered, "Thank you for taking my call. I'm Eun Kyung, the lawyer representing Ji Min Jun." "Yes, of course," Dr. Seo replied, his tone professional but cautious. "I've been following the case closely. It's a tragic situation." "It is," Eun Kyung agreed, "and I'm hoping you can help me understand Min Jun's condition better. From what I've read, he was diagnosed with dementia several years ago, but I need to know how advanced it is and how it might have contributed to what happened." Dr. Seo was silent for a moment before he spoke again. Min Jun's dementia has been progressing rapidly over the past year. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which affects both memory and behavior. In the early stages, he was still relatively independent, but over the last 12 months, his cognitive functions have declined significantly. He often forgets where he is, becomes agitated easily, and can't recognize people he's known for years. Eun Kyung listened carefully, scribbling notes on the pad in front of her. This was exactly what she needed to build her defense, a clear picture of how the disease had taken over Min Jun's life. "And the night of the incident?" she asked. "Do you think his dementia played a role in what happened?" "I have no doubt about it," Dr. Seo said firmly. "Patients with advanced Alzheimer's can experience something called sundowning syndrome. It's common for their symptoms to worsen in the late afternoon or evening. Confusion, aggression, and agitation can all increase during these hours. It's very possible that Min Jun was experiencing a sundowning episode when he attacked his roommate." Sundowning syndrome. It was a term Eun Kyung had encountered before, but never in this context. She quickly jotted it down, making a mental note to research it further. This could be a key part of her defense, a medical explanation for Min Jun's behavior that night. "Thank you, Dr. Seo," Eun Kyung said. "Your insight has been incredibly helpful. I'll likely need you to testify in court about this." "Of course," Dr. Seo replied. "I'll do whatever I can to help Min Jun. He's a good man, but this disease has taken everything from him." As the call ended, Eun Kyung felt a renewed sense of purpose. She now had a clearer understanding of the medical aspects of the case, but that was only the beginning. She still needed to interview the staff at the nursing home, gather witness statements, and dig deeper into Min Jun's life before dementia had taken hold. Over the next few days, Eun Kyung immersed herself in the details of the case. She spent hours poring over medical journals, learning everything she could about Alzheimer's disease and its effects. The more she read, the more she realized just how devastating the illness was. It didn't just steal memories, it stole a person's very sense of self. Min Jun, once a proud father and businessman, had been reduced to a confused, frightened man who no longer understood the world around him. She also made a visit to the nursing home where the incident had occurred. The building itself was unassuming, with neatly manicured lawns and pastel-colored walls. But inside, the atmosphere was heavy with the quiet resignation of its residents. Most of them, like Min Jun, were suffering from various forms of dementia, their minds lost in the fog of forgotten memories. Eun Kyung met with Mrs. Han, the director of the nursing home, who had been on duty the night of the attack. Mrs. Han was a kind woman in her 50s, with a weary look in her eyes that spoke of years spent caring for the elderly. "I'm sorry for what happened," Mrs. Han said, as she led Eun Kyung through the dimly lit hallways. Min Jun was always a gentle man, but in the past few months, his behavior became more erratic. He'd get confused, sometimes thinking his roommate was an intruder. We tried to keep him calm, but there were only so many staff on duty that night. Were there any signs that something like this could happen? Eun Kyung asked, glancing at the empty chairs and walkers lining the walls. We'd seen a few minor outbursts before, Mrs. Han admitted, but nothing like this. It wasn't until later that we realized he was having a severe episode. His dementia had advanced much faster than we anticipated. As they walked through the nursing home, Eun Kyung felt a deep sense of empathy for the residents. They were all trapped in their own worlds, disconnected from the reality around them. For Min Jun, that disconnection had turned into violence, a tragic, heartbreaking result of a disease that had consumed him. After leaving the nursing home, Eun Kyung returned to her office, her mind filled with the details of the case. She knew the legal strategies she needed to take, but it wouldn't be easy. She would argue that Min Jun's dementia, particularly the sundowning syndrome, had caused the attack, and that he was not responsible for his actions in the way a fully cognizant person would be. The challenge would be convincing the court that dementia could strip a man of his intent, his reason, and his control. The days ahead would be long, and the courtroom would once again be a battlefield. But Eun Kyung was determined to defend Min Jun with everything she had. This case wasn't just about winning. It was about ensuring that a man who had lost so much wasn't further punished for something beyond his control. The days following her visit to the nursing home were a blur of research and preparation for Eun Kyung. As the complexities of Min Jun's case unfolded, she became more focused, more determined to understand the full scope of his condition. One term stood out in her mind above all others: sundowning syndrome. It was a phrase Dr. Seo had mentioned briefly during their call, and while she had made a note of it at the time, Eun Kyung knew that it would play a crucial role in her defense strategy. Sundowning syndrome, as she had learned through hours of poring over medical journals and case studies, was a phenomenon that affected people with dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease. As the sun set and the day faded into evening, patients would often become more confused, agitated, and even aggressive. It was as if the fading light triggered something in their brains, causing their already fragile grasp on reality to slip even further. For someone like Min Jun, who was already battling severe memory loss and disorientation, sundowning syndrome could have easily been the catalyst for the violent outburst that led to the stabbing of his roommate. Sitting in her office late one evening, surrounded by stacks of medical documents, Eun Kyung leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. She had been working non-stop, trying to piece together the medical explanation that would help the court understand Min Jun's actions. It wasn't enough to simply say that he had dementia. She needed to show the jury, in no uncertain terms, that Min Jun was not in control of himself the night of the incident. He had been a victim of his own deteriorating mind, his actions driven by confusion and fear brought on by his condition. The challenge lay in presenting the medical facts in a way that was both understandable and persuasive. Courts were used to dealing with clear-cut cases, evidence of intent, motive, action. But this case was different. Min Jun's actions weren't born out of malice or a desire to cause harm. They were the result of a brain that no longer functioned as it should, a man whose perception of reality had been fractured by illness. Eun Kyung had already spoken with Dr. Seo several more times, gathering detailed accounts of Min Jun's symptoms, his medical history, and the specific ways in which Alzheimer's disease had affected him. Each conversation had reinforced her belief that sundowning syndrome was a key factor in the attack. But understanding the medical side was only part of the equation. She also needed to anticipate how the prosecution would argue against her defense. They would likely try to paint Min Jun as dangerous, a man who had stabbed his roommate without provocation. They would argue that, regardless of his condition, he posed a threat to others. Eun Kyung had to be ready to counter those claims. The next step was to consult with experts who could testify about the medical realities of Alzheimer's and sundowning syndrome in court. She needed someone who could explain the science behind Minjun's behavior, someone who could break it down for the jury in a way that made sense and evoked empathy. This wasn't just about proving a point. It was about making the jury understand that what had happened was beyond Minjun's control. Eun Kyung picked up the phone and dialed Dr. Park, a neurologist who specialized in dementia and neurodegenerative diseases. She had been referred to him by Dr. Seo, who had spoken highly of his expertise in cases involving Alzheimer's patients. "Dr. Park, this is Eun Kyung," she began once the call connected. "I'm the lawyer representing Ji Min-jun, and I was hoping to get your expert opinion on sundowning syndrome and how it might have influenced his actions." Dr. Park's voice was calm and professional. "I've read about Mr. G's case. It's not uncommon for patients with advanced Alzheimer's to experience episodes of heightened confusion and agitation in the evening. Sundowning syndrome can exacerbate these symptoms, making them more prone to aggression, even if they have no history of violence. That's exactly what I'm trying to explain to the court," Eun Kyung said, feeling a surge of relief that Dr. Park understood the gravity of the situation. "But I need to make sure the jury sees this not as an excuse, but as a legitimate medical condition that explains his actions." "Sundowning syndrome is well documented," Dr. Park replied. "It's caused by a combination of factors: disruption in the body's circadian rhythms, sensory overload, and even fatigue from the day's activities. For someone with Alzheimer's, it's like their brain is shutting down as the day ends, and they lose what little control they have left. In Mr. G's case, it's entirely plausible that he didn't understand what he was doing when he attacked his roommate. His brain simply couldn't process what was happening." Eun Kyung listened carefully, her mind already racing with how she could use this in court. "Would you be willing to testify as an expert witness? I think having someone with your background explain this to the jury could make all the difference." "I'd be happy to testify," Dr. Park agreed. "I've worked on cases like this before, and it's important that the court understands how devastating Alzheimer's can be, not just for the patient, but for everyone around them." With Dr. Park on board, Eun Kyung felt more confident in her defense. She had the medical facts, the expert testimony, and a growing understanding of how Minjun's condition had led to the tragic events of that night. Now, it was a matter of presenting everything in a way that would resonate with the jury. The trial date was approaching quickly, and Eun Kyung knew that every detail mattered. She spent long hours preparing her opening statement, carefully crafting each sentence to introduce the concept of sundowning syndrome and explain how it had influenced Minjun's actions. She knew that some of the jurors might be skeptical at first, unsure of how to reconcile the violent act with the idea that it wasn't truly Minjun's fault. But she believed in her case. She believed that if she could explain the science behind it, if she could show them the human side of dementia, they would understand. The day of the trial arrived, and Eun Kyung felt a familiar mixture of anxiety and determination as she entered the courtroom. Minjun was already seated at the defense table, his hands trembling slightly as he stared blankly ahead. The once proud man had been reduced to a shell of his former self, his mind lost in the fog of his illness. As the trial began, the prosecution laid out their case, focusing on the violence of the act and the injuries suffered by Minjun's roommate. They described the night in vivid detail, painting a picture of chaos and fear. The prosecution argued that, regardless of Minjun's condition, he had attacked another person with a weapon, and he needed to be held accountable for his actions. But Eun Kyung was ready. When it was her turn to speak, she rose from her seat, her voice steady but filled with purpose. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, "this case is not about a man with intent to harm. It is about a man who has lost control of his mind. Ji Min-jun is not a criminal. He is a man suffering from a devastating disease that affects every aspect of his life. On the night in question, Min-jun was not acting out of malice. He was experiencing the effects of sundowning syndrome, a well-documented condition that affects patients with dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease. His actions were not his own. They were the result of a brain that no longer functions as it should." As she continued, Eun Kyung laid out the medical evidence, explaining how sundowning syndrome had likely triggered Min-jun's outburst. She referenced Dr. Park's upcoming testimony and detailed the neurological factors that had led to the violent episode. By the time she finished her statement, The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Over the next few days, as the trial unfolded, Dr. Park took the stand, explaining the science behind Alzheimer's and sundowning syndrome. His calm, authoritative manner made a strong impression on the jury, and Eun Kyung could see that they were beginning to understand the complexity of Min Jun's condition. The prosecution continued to push back, arguing that the law must apply regardless of the circumstances. But Eun Kyung stayed firm. She knew that this case was about more than just the law. It was about compassion, about recognizing the humanity in someone who had lost so much to an illness beyond their control. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, Eun Kyung felt a sense of calm settle over her. She had done everything she could. Now, it was up to the jury to decide. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as the trial for Ji Min Jun entered its most critical phase. Days of testimony had passed, filled with expert opinions, witness statements, and endless debates. But the heart of the case still revolved around one key question. Could someone with advanced dementia be held criminally responsible for an act they no longer had the cognitive capacity to understand? This was the ethical dilemma that now hung over everyone in the room. Eun Kyung sat at the defense table, her hands resting calmly on the files in front of her, though the weight of the responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. Across the room, the prosecution was preparing for what would likely be their most aggressive argument, yet that despite his condition, Ji Min Jun should still be held accountable for stabbing his roommate, a violent act that had left the man seriously injured. The law, they would argue, was clear. A crime had been committed, and there had to be consequences. But for Eun Kyung, this wasn't just a matter of law. It was a matter of justice and humanity. Min Jun was not a criminal. He was a man suffering from a devastating illness, a man who had lost control of his mind and body. Her task was to convince the court not only of his innocence, but also of the broader ethical implications of punishing someone who no longer had the ability to make rational decisions. The judge called the court to order, and the air was thick with tension as the prosecution began their final push. Prosecutor Jin Soo, a sharp and methodical attorney, stepped forward, his gaze moving slowly across the jury as he spoke. Members of the jury, Jin Soo began, his voice steady and authoritative. What we have here is a case of extreme violence. Mr. Ji Min Jun attacked another man, stabbing him repeatedly. The victim could have died. We cannot overlook this. While the defense has presented evidence of Mr. Ji's illness, the fact remains: a crime was committed, and the law demands accountability. The victim deserves justice. Jin Soo's words were carefully chosen, meant to appeal to the jurors' sense of fairness and duty. He wasn't dismissing Min Jun's dementia, but he was framing it as secondary to the violence that had occurred. His argument was clear. No matter the circumstances, someone had been hurt, and someone had to be held responsible. Eun Kyung knew this would be the prosecution's strategy. She had anticipated it, but now came the challenge of responding not just with facts, but with compassion. She rose from her seat, her expression calm but determined. As she made her way to the center of the courtroom, all eyes turned to her, waiting to hear how she would counter the prosecution's argument. Members of the jury, Eun Kyung began, her voice soft but firm. This case is not about denying the pain that was caused. What happened that night was tragic, and there is no doubt that Mr. Ji Min Jun's actions resulted in serious harm. But this case is not about punishing a man for an act he committed while fully in control of his faculties. It's about understanding the reality of dementia, an illness that strips people of their identity, their memories, and their ability to make reasoned choices. She paused, letting her words settle in the room before continuing. Mr. Ji Min Jun did not act with criminal intent. He was not seeking to harm anyone. He was experiencing the effects of sundowning syndrome, a condition associated with advanced Alzheimer's disease, in which patients become confused, disoriented, and even aggressive as the day turns to night. His mind, which once understood right from wrong, is now a fragmented version of what it used to be. His actions that night were not those of a rational man, they were the actions of someone whose brain no longer functions the way it should. Eun Kyung turned slightly, her gaze moving to the jury. We have to ask ourselves, what does justice look like in a case like this? Is it truly justice to send a man who can barely remember his own name to prison? A man who doesn't even understand what he's being punished for? Or is it just more humane to ensure that he receives the treatment and care he needs in a medical facility where his condition can be managed and where he is no longer a danger to anyone? The room was silent, the gravity of her words hanging in the air. Eun Kyung knew she was walking a fine line between legal argument and moral appeal. But this case demanded more than just a technical defense. It required a deep understanding of what it meant to be human. As the day wore on, the courtroom became a battleground for ethical debate. The prosecution continued to push for a guilty verdict, arguing that even if Min Jun had diminished capacity, the law required some form of accountability. They cited precedents in which individuals with mental illness had been convicted and sent to prison, arguing that dementia should not serve as a free pass for violent behavior. But Eun Kyung stood her ground, returning to the core of her argument: intent. In criminal law, intent was everything. And in this case, there was no intent to harm. There was only confusion, fear, and the tragic consequences of a failing mind. The judge, sensing the complexity of the case, allowed for extended arguments from both sides. At one point, Dr. Park, the neurologist, was called back to the stand, where he provided further testimony about the nature of Alzheimer's and its impact on a person's cognitive abilities. Dementia, particularly in its advanced stages, completely alters the way a person perceives the world, Dr. Park explained. Mr. G's brain no longer processes information the way yours or mine does. He may not even recognize familiar faces or understand where he is. To expect him to adhere to the same standards of accountability as someone with full mental capacity is simply not fair, nor is it just. As the trial continued, it became clear that the courtroom was divided. Some jurors seemed sympathetic to Min Jun's plight, nodding as they listened to the expert testimony and Eun Kyung's impassioned arguments. Others, however, remained unmoved, their expressions hard and skeptical. They couldn't shake the image of a man who had committed violence, regardless of his condition. The tension in the room grew as the trial neared its conclusion. Eun Kyung could feel the weight of the moral dilemma pressing down on everyone involved. This wasn't just about Min Jun. It was about how society treated those who were no longer fully themselves, those whose actions were dictated by forces beyond their control. In her final remarks, Eun Kyung stood before the jury once more, her voice calm but filled with quiet resolve. This case is about more than just one man's actions. It's about how we, as a society, choose to handle those who are most vulnerable. Mr. G. Min Jun did not choose to have dementia. He did not choose to lose his memories, his identity, his ability to think clearly. But the law is not designed for cases like this, cases where illness erases intent, where confusion replaces reason. I ask you to consider what justice truly means in this case. Is it just to punish a man who can no longer understand the world around him? Or is it just to ensure that he receives the care and treatment he so desperately needs? As she sat down, Eun Kyung felt a deep sense of exhaustion. She had done everything she could to make the jury see the humanity in Min Jun, to see that this was not about punishing a criminal, but about understanding the tragic consequences of a cruel disease. The jury would deliberate soon, and their decision would carry profound implications not just for Min Jun, but for how the law viewed responsibility in cases of severe mental decline. For now, all Eun Kyung could do was wait. The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for the judge's decision. Days of testimony, legal arguments, and ethical debates had come to this final moment. Eun Kyung sat quietly at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her, Ji Min Jun sat staring blankly ahead, his expression distant, as though he were unaware of the gravity of the situation. It was the result of his illness. Alzheimer's had stolen much of his awareness, leaving him disconnected from the world around him. The trial had been grueling, filled with intense arguments from both sides. The prosecution had fought hard, pushing for a conviction that would hold Min Jun accountable for the violent attack on his roommate. But Eun Kyung had countered with everything she had, relying on expert testimony and medical evidence to show that Min Jun's actions were the result of dementia, particularly the effects of sundowning syndrome. It wasn't a case of criminal intent, it was a tragic consequence of a deteriorating mind. As the judge finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension in the room, Eun Kyung felt her heart skip a beat. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, including the medical testimony regarding Mr. Ji Min-jun's advanced dementia, it is clear to this court that Mr. Ji was not in full control of his actions on the night in question. His behavior, while violent, was driven by his illness, not by criminal intent. The court acknowledges the profound impact Alzheimer's disease can have on an individual's cognitive abilities and decision-making processes. The judge paused, looking down at the papers before him, then back up at the room. However, this court also recognizes the harm caused to the victim in this case. While Mr. Ji may not have intended to cause harm, the fact remains that his actions led to serious injury. Therefore, it is the court's decision to impose a reduced sentence, focused not on punishment, but on treatment. Mr. Ji will not be sent to prison. Instead, he will be transferred to a specialized medical facility equipped to handle patients with severe dementia. There, he will receive the care and treatment he needs, and he will remain under supervision for the remainder of his life. A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom as the judge's decision sank in. It was a partial victory for Eun Kyung. While Min-jun would not face prison time, he would spend the rest of his days in a medical facility, a place where his condition could be managed and where he would no longer pose a danger to others. Eun Kyung allowed herself a small sigh of relief. It wasn't the complete exoneration she had hoped for, but it was still a success. Min-jun wouldn't be punished for something he couldn't control. He would get the treatment he needed, away from the harshness of the criminal justice system. She glanced at Min-jun, wondering if he even understood what had just happened. His face remained expressionless, lost in the fog of his illness. It was a bittersweet moment. He had been spared prison, but his life had already been taken by Alzheimer's in so many ways. After the court adjourned, Eun Kyung gathered her papers and slowly made her way out of the room. The conversations buzzing around her were no longer about Min-jun's individual case, but about the broader issues the trial had raised. As she passed by clusters of reporters and legal observers, she heard fragments of their discussions. This case really highlights the challenges of dealing with aging populations, one person said. We're going to see more cases like this as dementia becomes more common. Yeah, but where do you draw the line between medical treatment and criminal responsibility? Another voice added. It's a tricky balance. Eun Kyung knew they were right. This case had opened up a larger conversation about how society treated its elderly, particularly those with severe medical conditions like dementia. The law, which was designed to deal with clear-cut cases of guilt and innocence, struggled to accommodate situations like Min-jun's where the mind had deteriorated to the point where intent and responsibility were no longer simple matters. The trial had exposed the gaps in the legal system when it came to addressing the complexities of aging and mental decline. It wasn't just about Min-jun, it was about a growing population of elderly individuals who would face similar challenges in the future. As lifespans increased and more people developed conditions like Alzheimer's, the legal system would need to adapt. It was no longer just about crime and punishment. It was about how to ensure that justice took into account the realities of aging and cognitive decline. Later that evening, Eun Kyung sat alone in her office, reflecting on the case. She felt a mixture of emotions: relief that Min-jun had been spared prison, but also a deep sadness for the man he had once been, before dementia had taken everything from him. She thought about the ethical dilemmas the case had raised, not just for her as a lawyer, but for the entire system. How should society handle those who were no longer capable of controlling their actions? How could the law be adapted to protect both the individuals suffering from these conditions and the people around them? Eun Kyung also thought about her own future as a lawyer. This case had challenged her in ways she hadn't expected, pushing her beyond the legal arguments she was used to and into the realm of ethics and morality. She had fought not just for Min-jun's legal rights, but for his humanity. And in doing so, she had gained a deeper understanding of what it meant to be an advocate not just for justice, but for compassion. As the weeks passed, the discussions about Min-jun's case continued in legal circles, in the media, and in the public. People debated the issues of autonomy, aging, and criminal responsibility, questioning how society should treat those whose minds were no longer their own. The case had set a precedent, one that would likely be referenced in future trials involving elderly individuals with dementia or other cognitive disorders. But for Eun Kyung, the most important takeaway from the case wasn't about setting legal precedent. It was about the people at the heart of these cases, the individuals like Min-jun, who were trapped in their own minds, and the families who had to watch as their loved ones slowly faded away. It was about the need for understanding and empathy, even in a system that so often prioritized punishment over care. As she prepared for her next case, Eun Kyung knew that this trial had changed her. She had always been dedicated to the law, but now she understood that being a lawyer meant more than just winning cases. It meant fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, for those whose voices have been silenced by illness or circumstance. It meant pushing for a justice system that recognized the complexity of human experience, one that didn't just see the world in black and white. The victory in court had been partial, but the impact of the case would be long-lasting. It had sparked a conversation that needed to happen, a conversation about how society treated its most vulnerable members and what kind of justice they truly deserved. And for Eun Kyung, that was enough. In the quiet aftermath of Ji Min-jun's case, Eun Kyung found herself sitting at her desk, staring blankly at the files piled in front of her. The courtroom had been a battleground, as always, but this time something had shifted inside her. The weight of defending Min-jun, a man whose mind was no longer his own, had left her with more than just a legal victory. It had left her with questions about empathy, emotion, and how they intertwined with the law. Eun Kyung had always approached her cases with sharp logic and meticulous attention to detail. She saw the world through the lens of facts, rules, and evidence. It was how she had been raised, how she had trained her mind to function. Her analytical abilities were what had allowed her to rise in her career, even when others doubted her because of her condition. But this case had forced her to confront something she had long avoided: empathy. Empathy had always been an elusive concept for Eun Kyung. She could understand it on an intellectual level. She could recognize when someone was suffering or in need, but she often struggled to connect with those emotions on a personal level. It wasn't that she didn't care. She did deeply. But understanding and processing the emotions of others, especially in high-stakes situations, felt like trying to navigate a foreign language. As she sat in her office, the low hum of the building around her, Eun Kyung reflected on the conversations she had had with Dr. Park and the other experts during Min-jun's trial. They had spoken about Min-jun's condition with such warmth, such understanding of the human toll that Alzheimer's took not just on the patient, but on their families, their caretakers, everyone around them. Eun Kyung had absorbed their words, had even used them to build her case. But only now, in the stillness, did she realize how much the case had required her to step outside of her comfort zone. In the courtroom, she had argued fiercely, as she always did, for Min-jun's innocence. But the truth was, this time, her argument hadn't been just about the facts. It had been about the person. She had felt the need to protect Min-jun, not because he was her client, but because he was vulnerable, trapped in a mind that betrayed him. It was a feeling she hadn't quite been able to name during the trial, but now she understood. It was empathy. She leaned back in her chair, staring up at the ceiling as she replayed the trial in her mind. She had seen the confusion in Min-jun's eyes every time he was brought into the courtroom. She had watched him struggle to comprehend what was happening, and each time, her heart had twisted in a way she hadn't expected. She had been defending him with more than just her legal knowledge. She had been defending him with a growing sense of compassion for what he had lost. But empathy didn't come naturally to her. She knew that. In the past, she had often been accused of being too cold, too detached from the emotional elements of her cases. Even in her personal life, she struggled with connecting to the feelings of others. It wasn't that she didn't care, she simply didn't always know how to express it in a way that others understood. Her thoughts drifted to her colleagues at Hambada. While many now respected her for her legal acumen, there was still a distance between her and the rest of the team. She often felt like an outsider, watching from the edges as they chatted easily, laughed together, formed bonds that went beyond the office. She had always struggled to break into those social circles, to understand the unspoken dynamics that govern friendships and relationships. She had tried, in her own way, but it often felt like her efforts fell short, leaving her more isolated than before. Eun Kyung had long accepted that her mind worked differently from others, and she had learned to embrace her strengths. But now, for the first time, she was beginning to question if her difficulties with emotions were holding her back in more ways than she had realized. Ji Min-jun's case had shown her just how important empathy was, not just for understanding others, but for truly connecting with them. It wasn't enough to know the law, to know the facts. Sometimes people needed to feel understood. A soft knock on her office door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Chung-hee, her colleague who had always been kind to her, even when others had been distant. He stepped into the room, his expression gentle, as if he could sense that she was deep in thought. "Hey," he said quietly, "I just wanted to see how you're doing after the trial." "That was a tough one." Eun-kyung nodded, her eyes meeting his briefly before flicking back to the files on her desk. "It was," she admitted, "but I'm glad we got a fair outcome for Min-jun." Chung-hee smiled, leaning against the doorframe. "You did great in there. It wasn't an easy case, but you handled it with so much care." Care. That word lingered in the air for a moment. Eun-kyung hadn't thought of it that way, but she supposed that's what it was. She had cared about Min-jun, in her own way. She had cared enough to push herself beyond her usual methods, to argue not just for the facts, but for his humanity. "I've been thinking a lot about the case," she said slowly, unsure how to articulate the thoughts swirling in her mind. "About empathy, and how it affects everything. Not just the case, but how we interact with people." Chung-hee's expression softened. He nodded, as if he understood exactly what she was getting at. "Yeah, empathy can be tricky, especially when you're used to focusing on logic and facts. But it's important. It's what makes us human, right?" Eun-kyung looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the edge of a piece of paper. "I think I'm not very good at it. Empathy, I understand it in theory, but when it comes to really connecting with people, I don't know if I know how." Chung-hee stepped closer, his voice gentle. "You're better at it than you think. You've just spent so much time relying on your mind, on your abilities, that maybe you've forgotten that you have a heart, too." His words caught her off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She had always relied on her intellect, her sharp mind, because that was what had made her successful. But maybe there was something to what he was saying. Maybe she had been so focused on excelling in the legal world that she had neglected the emotional side of herself, the part that connected with others on a deeper level. "I've seen it in you," Chung-hee continued. "The way you handled Min-jun's case, it wasn't just about the law for you. You cared about him. You wanted to make sure he was treated with dignity." Eun-kyung looked up at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "I didn't I?" she said quietly, more to herself than to him. He smiled again, a soft, reassuring smile. "Yeah, you did. And that's empathy, Eun-kyung. It's not about being perfect at it or always knowing the right thing to say. It's about caring, and you care more than you realize." As he left the room, Eun-kyung sat in silence, the weight of his words settling over her like a warm blanket. She had always been so focused on her work, on proving herself, that she hadn't taken the time to consider how empathy played into it all. But now, after this case, she could see that it was something she needed to understand better, not just for her clients, but for herself. She had won the case for Min-jun, but in doing so, she had learned something far more valuable. Empathy wasn't something that came easily to her, but it was something she could nurture. It wasn't about feeling everything the way others did, it was about finding her own way to connect, to care, to understand. As she closed her files for the night, Eun-kyung felt a sense of quiet resolve. She would continue to work on her legal skills, of course, but now she had something else to work on herself. And for the first time, she felt ready to face that challenge. As the days passed following the conclusion of Ji Min-jun's trial, the routines at Hanbada law firm returned to normal. Cases came and went, meetings were held, and deadlines loomed as always. But something in Eun-kyung's life had shifted. It wasn't just her growing understanding of empathy after the emotional trial. There was also a subtle, yet undeniable, change in the way she interacted with Chung-hee. Chung-hee had always been kind to her, supportive in ways that other colleagues hadn't been. He didn't treat her as an outsider or speak to her with the cautious distance that so many others at the firm did. He was simply there, always willing to listen or offer help, always managing to navigate her silences and social awkwardness with a quiet understanding. Their relationship, though mostly professional, had a warmth to it that Eun-kyung hadn't fully recognized before. But now, after everything that had happened, she could feel it evolving, becoming something more. It started with small moments, a quiet conversation after work, where they lingered a little longer than usual, discussing not just cases but life outside of the firm. Or the way he'd stop by her office, leaning on the doorframe with a relaxed smile, asking if she needed help or if she wanted to grab a coffee. It wasn't just his presence, but the way he seemed to understand her without asking for explanations. He didn't pry, didn't pressure her to speak when she was overwhelmed. He simply gave her space while being there when she needed someone. But with that growing connection came something else: confusion. For Eun Kyung, understanding human emotions, especially romantic ones, was like trying to read a language she didn't quite know. She recognized the signs, the little cues in how he looked at her, how he seemed to pay extra attention when they talked, the subtle pauses in their conversations, where it felt like something was left unsaid, the way his smile would linger a bit longer when their eyes met. She wasn't oblivious, but she also wasn't sure how to process it. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, Eun Kyung found herself sitting across from Chung Hee in a small cafe just down the street from Hambada. The place was quiet, with soft music playing in the background, and the low hum of conversation around them felt almost distant. Chung Hee had suggested they grab a coffee after work, and though she had hesitated at first, she had agreed. Now, sitting there with him, she could feel an odd mixture of comfort and nervousness settling in her chest. "You've seemed quieter than usual," Chung Hee remarked, his eyes studying her face. "Are you still thinking about Minjun's case?" Eun Kyung nodded, staring down into her cup. "A little. It's hard to forget cases like that. It wasn't just about the law, it felt personal." "I get that," he said softly, leaning forward slightly. "You put so much of yourself into that case. It's no wonder it's still on your mind." She looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "But you do that too, don't you? You're always so involved in your work and helping people." He smiled, a small, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Yeah, but it's different for me. You care in a way that's different from everyone else here, Eun Kyung. You might not show it the same way, but it's there." Her heart skipped a beat at his words, and she wasn't sure why. There was something in the way he said it, in the sincerity behind his voice, that made her feel exposed, seen, and that was what confused her the most. She had never quite known how to handle these kinds of emotions, and now that she was beginning to sense something deeper between them, she wasn't sure how to respond. For the next few moments, they sat in silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, but one filled with unspoken thoughts, things hovering just beneath the surface. Eun Kyung fidgeted with her spoon, her mind racing. She was trying to make sense of the way she felt about the case, about her growing understanding of empathy, and now about Chung Hee. It wasn't that she didn't notice his kindness or the way he seemed to go out of his way to support her, but there was a disconnect between noticing those things and understanding what they meant on a deeper level. Was he just being a good friend? Or was there something more? And if there was something more, how was she supposed to react? Chung Hee broke the silence first. "You know," he said quietly, "I've always admired how strong you are. The way you handle yourself, even when things are difficult." She glanced up at him, caught off guard by the sudden shift in the conversation. "I don't know if I'm as strong as you think." "You are," he insisted gently. "You've been through a lot, but you never let it stop you. You just keep pushing forward, even when things are hard. That's not something everyone can do." Eun Kyung felt her chest tighten. She wasn't used to hearing such direct praise, especially about something so personal. She was used to compliments about her work, her intelligence, her skills. But this felt different. It was about her as a person, and that made her uncomfortable. Not because it wasn't true, but because she didn't know how to respond to it. "Thank you," she said softly, unsure of what else to say. I do what I have to." Chung Hee nodded, his eyes soft as he looked at her. "I know, but I think there's more to you than just doing what you have to. You care about people, even if you don't always know how to show it. And I care about you, Eun Kyung." Her breath caught in her throat. The words hung in the air between them, and suddenly, everything felt different. It was as if the quiet tension that had been building for weeks had finally been acknowledged, laid bare in the space between them. Eun Kyung's mind raced, trying to process what he had just said. He cared about her. But what did that mean? Did it mean the same thing it meant to her? And what did it mean to her? She blinked, staring at him as her thoughts spun in circles. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, a sensation she wasn't used to, a sensation that made her feel out of control. She wasn't sure if it was excitement, fear, or something in between. She had always struggled with these kinds of emotions that weren't tied to logic or reason, but to something deeper, more instinctual. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't really understand these kinds of things. Chung-hee's expression softened even more, and he reached across the table, his hand gently resting on hers. You don't have to say anything right now. I just wanted you to know how I feel. We can figure it out together whenever you're ready. The warmth of his hand on hers grounded her, pulling her out of the chaos of her thoughts. She looked down at their hands, her mind still a jumble of emotions she couldn't fully process. But there was something comforting in the simplicity of the gesture. It wasn't demanding or overwhelming. It was just there, steady and calm, like Chung-hee himself. For the first time in a long while, Eun-kyung felt something other than confusion. She felt a sense of possibility, even if she didn't yet fully understand it. And for now, that was enough. They sat there in the cafe for a while longer, the conversation shifting back to easier topics, but the unspoken truth between them lingered. Eun-kyung knew that she wasn't ready to fully confront whatever it was she felt for Chung-hee. She wasn't even sure she understood it. But what she did know was that he was there for her, patient and kind, and that, more than anything, made her feel something she couldn't quite name. As they left the cafe and walked back toward the office, Eun-kyung realized that her world, once so defined by logic and order, was slowly starting to open up in ways she hadn't anticipated. And while it scared her, it also intrigued her. Maybe, just maybe, she could figure out what it meant to let someone in, even if it took time, even if it was confusing. She glanced at Chung-hee as they walked, and for the first time, she allowed herself to consider that maybe, in the midst of all her uncertainties, she wasn't entirely alone. Eun-kyung sat in her office, her mind still swirling with thoughts of the growing connection between her and Chung-hee. Their recent conversation in the cafe had left her feeling unsettled in a way she wasn't used to. But before she could fully process those emotions, her focus was drawn back to the legal documents spread across her desk. A new case had landed in her lap, and while it seemed trivial on the surface, something about it tugged at her in a way she hadn't expected. Seo Jun was the client, a young woman in her mid-20s who was suing a high-end bridal shop after a wardrobe malfunction had nearly ruined her wedding day. The case itself was fairly straightforward. Seo Jun had ordered an expensive, custom-made wedding dress from the boutique, but on the day of the ceremony, the dress hadn't been properly fitted. As a result, the gown had slipped at a critical moment, leaving Seo Jun humiliated in front of her guests. What should have been the happiest day of her life had turned into a disaster. As Eun-kyung skimmed through the details of the case, she frowned slightly. On the surface, it seemed simple enough: a breach of contract, failure to deliver the services promised. But there was something in the way Seo Jun had spoken during their initial meeting that had stayed with Eun-kyung. Seo Jun hadn't just been angry or upset about the dress. She had been devastated, in a way that felt deeper than a mere clothing malfunction. There was a fragility in her voice, a sense of something more than just embarrassment. It wasn't just about the dress, Seo Jun had said, her eyes downcast. It was about everything. That day was supposed to be perfect. I wanted everything to be perfect. And when it wasn't, I felt like I had failed. Those words had struck Eun-kyung, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps it was because they reminded her of the pressures she had faced in her own life, pressures to meet expectations, to be flawless in the eyes of others. Seo Jun's case was about more than a dress. It was about the weight of societal expectations, the unspoken pressure to achieve perfection, especially on days as significant as a wedding. Eun-kyung could see that now, even if it wasn't immediately obvious in the legal documents. The lawsuit itself had the potential to be straightforward, legally speaking. Seo Jun was seeking compensation for emotional distress and damages caused by the dress's failure, claiming that the boutique had breached their contract by not providing the proper fit in time. The bridal shop, of course, had denied responsibility, stating that Seo Jun had refused the final fitting, and they couldn't be held liable for her decision. It was a typical back and forth of he said, she said. But as Eun-kyung dug deeper, she realized there were layers to this case that couldn't be ignored. Eun-kyung leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the desk as she thought about the social weight that weddings carried. The idea of the perfect day was something that society had long ingrained in women, particularly in places like South Korea, where weddings were monumental events. For Seo Jun, the dress wasn't just a garment, it was a symbol of her dreams, her identity, and her desire to live up to the image of what a bride should be. Eun Kyung had never been one to dwell on these societal pressures, at least not in the way others seemed to. Her focus had always been on her career, on achieving excellence in the legal field. But even she couldn't entirely escape the expectations placed on women. She had felt them in subtle ways throughout her life, the pressure to be more social, to fit in, to connect emotionally with people when it didn't come naturally to her. Now, looking at Seo Jun's case, she saw a mirror of those pressures reflected back at her. She decided it was time to meet with Seo Jun again, to dig deeper into her emotional state and understand how much this incident had truly impacted her. It was clear that the lawsuit wasn't just about financial compensation, it was about something much more personal. If Eun Kyung was going to defend Seo Jun properly, she needed to understand the full scope of her client's emotional burden. The next day, Eun Kyung met Seo Jun in one of the firm's conference rooms. The young woman looked more composed than she had during their initial meeting, but there was still a trace of sadness in her eyes. She had dark hair that fell in soft waves around her face, and her hands fidgeted with the edge of her purse as she sat down. "Thank you for coming in again," Eun Kyung said as she took a seat across from her. "I wanted to go over some more details about the case, but also, I'd like to understand more about how this experience has affected you personally." Seo Jun nodded, though her expression tightened slightly. "I know it might seem silly, suing over a wedding dress, but that day it was supposed to be perfect. I had spent so long planning everything. I wanted it to be flawless. And then, when the dress slipped," her voice broke for a moment, and she paused, composing herself before continuing. "Everyone was watching. It was like all eyes were on me, waiting for me to fail. I felt humiliated, like I wasn't enough, like I couldn't even get this one thing right." Eun Kyung's heart twinged with a flicker of empathy. She hadn't expected to feel so connected to Seo Jun's emotions, but she understood the weight of what she was saying. The feeling of not being enough, of failing at something that felt like it should have been within her control, it was a feeling Eun Kyung knew all too well. "I don't think it's silly at all," Eun Kyung said quietly, surprising even herself with the softness in her voice. "It's clear that this experience was deeply personal for you, and I want to make sure that we address that in our defense. The boutique is arguing that they offered you a final fitting and that you refused it. Is that true?" Seo Jun shook her head, her frustration evident. "No, they gave me a fitting, but it was rushed. I told them the dress didn't feel right, but they insisted it would be fine. I trusted them, they were the professionals after all, but they didn't listen. And when the dress slipped during the ceremony, it was like everything I had feared would happen did." Eun Kyung nodded, jotting down notes. "I understand. This isn't just about a dress malfunction. It's about the fact that they didn't provide the service they promised. You put your trust in them, and they failed you." Seo Jun's eyes flickered with a mix of relief and gratitude. "Yes, that's exactly it. It's not just the dress. It's that they didn't care. They didn't take my concerns seriously." As Eun Kyung continued to gather information, she realized that this case was more emotionally charged than she had initially anticipated. The dress, while a central part of the lawsuit, was merely a symbol of the larger issue, the pressure to live up to an ideal of perfection, and the deep emotional toll when that ideal shattered. After the meeting, Eun Kyung returned to her office, her mind turning over the various legal angles she could pursue. The breach of contract was clear, but she knew that the emotional aspect of the case was where she would have to focus. She could already imagine the boutique's lawyers dismissing Seo Jun's emotional distress as frivolous, something that didn't warrant serious consideration. But Eun Kyung knew better. She had seen how fragile people could be, how deeply they could be affected by events that others might deem insignificant. This case, she realized, wasn't just about money or reputations. It was about validating Seo Jun's pain, about showing that her emotions mattered, that she wasn't being irrational or dramatic. Eun Kyung had spent so much of her life being told that her own emotions didn't always fit with what others expected. She understood, now more than ever, that sometimes the fight wasn't just about winning in the courtroom, it was about giving people the space to be seen and heard. As the days passed and the trial date approached, Eun Kyung prepared her arguments with her usual precision, but this time with a new layer of awareness. She wasn't just fighting for a legal victory. She was fighting to help Seo Jun reclaim her sense of self, to show her that she hadn't failed, that the pressures of perfection weren't hers to bear alone. This case, like the ones before it, would test Eun Kyung's abilities in new ways. But she was ready, and as she delved deeper into the complexities of Seo Jun's emotions, she realized that this was more than just another lawsuit. It was a chance to confront the very human struggles that lay beneath the surface of every case, the struggles that people often try to hide, but that mattered most of all. The days following her initial meeting with Seo Jun were filled with careful preparation as Eun Kyung dove into the investigation surrounding the bridal shop and the mishap with the dress. On the surface, the case still seemed like a standard breach of contract. The shop had failed to provide the promised service, and Seo Jun had suffered as a result. But as Eun Kyung peeled back the layers, it became increasingly clear that the issue was not as simple as a poorly fitted gown. Eun Kyung began her investigation by reviewing every detail of the agreement between Seo Jun and the boutique. The contract was precise, outlining the timeline for fittings, adjustments, and final delivery of the dress. The shop had prided itself on offering a personalized, luxury experience for brides, and Seo Jun had paid a considerable amount of money to ensure her day would be perfect. But the question remained, where had it all gone wrong? To find out, Eun Kyung scheduled a visit to the bridal shop itself. The boutique, nestled in a fashionable district of Seoul, was as sleek and polished as one would expect for a high-end establishment. It was a place that catered to dreams, with rows of pristine white gowns displayed on mannequins, each one more elaborate than the next. A soft scent of lavender hung in the air, the lighting dimmed just enough to create a sense of intimacy. Everything about the shop was designed to make a bride feel special, to give her the illusion that perfection was within reach. But perfection, as Eun Kyung knew all too well, was a fragile concept. She was greeted by the shop's owner, Mrs. Kwon, an elegant woman in her early 50s with impeccably styled hair and a serene smile that hinted at years of experience handling demanding clients. Mrs. Kwon wasted no time in defending her shop's reputation. "We have been in business for over 20 years, she began, her voice smooth but firm. "We take great pride in our work, and we've never had a complaint like this before. Miss Seo Jun's situation is unfortunate, but we did everything in our power to ensure the dress was ready for her wedding." She refused the final fitting. Eun Kyung, as always, remained composed. "From what I understand, Miss Seo Jun raised concerns about the fit of the dress during the fitting, but she was reassured that everything would be fine." Mrs. Kwon waved her hand dismissively. She was nervous, as many brides are. "We assured her the dress would sit perfectly on the day. We see this kind of anxiety all the time. It's part of the emotional strain brides put on themselves." The way Mrs. Kwon spoke, as if Seo Jun's fears were nothing more than bridal jitters, rubbed Eun Kyung the wrong way. There was a condescension in her tone that seemed to suggest that Seo Jun's distress was exaggerated, a figment of her own insecurities rather than a legitimate grievance. "Be that as it may," Eun Kyung replied coolly, "Miss Seo Jun trusted your shop to deliver a dress that met the highest standards. When that didn't happen, it wasn't just about the dress, it was about the promises you made to her. She feels deeply betrayed." Mrs. Kwan's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "We take all our clients seriously, of course, but weddings are emotional affairs. Sometimes brides project their own anxieties onto the service providers. We did our job, we delivered the dress on time, and we did everything by the book." Eun Kyung thanked Mrs. Kwan for her time and left the shop, her mind buzzing with thoughts. She had gotten what she needed from the visit, confirmation that the boutique was intent on defending itself by downplaying Seo Jun's emotional response. But this case was no longer just about the technicalities of the contract. It was about the broader emotional landscape that surrounded weddings, and how those emotions could be weaponized by businesses like Mrs. Kwan's boutique. As she walked back to her office, Eun Kyung found herself thinking more deeply about what Seo Jun had said during their meetings. The pressure to have a perfect wedding, the fear of being judged, the overwhelming expectation that everything down to the smallest detail had to be flawless. Seo Jun had poured her heart and soul into planning that day, not just for herself, but for everyone around her. The dress had been a symbol of that perfection, and when it failed her, it felt like her entire world had crumbled. Back in her office, Eun Kyung called Seo Jun for another meeting. When Seo Jun arrived, she seemed more relaxed than before, though there was still a lingering sadness in her eyes. Eun Kyung sensed that beneath the surface, there were emotions that hadn't yet been fully unpacked. Seo Jun, I've spoken with the boutique, Eun Kyung began, watching her client's reaction carefully. They're maintaining that they did everything properly, and they're suggesting that the issue is more about your nerves than any real flaw in the dress. Seo Jun's face flushed slightly, her hands balling into fists in her lap. That's not true, she said, her voice trembling. I wasn't just nervous. I knew something was wrong with the fit, but they didn't listen. And when the dress slipped, it felt like everything I'd worked for was a joke. Eun Kyung leaned forward, her tone gentle but probing. I believe you, Seo Jun, but I think it's important to understand why this dress meant so much to you. I know it's not just about the wedding day itself. Can you tell me more about what this day represented for you? Seo Jun hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the vulnerability the question required. But eventually, she spoke, her voice soft and raw with emotion. I know it sounds silly, but I've always had this image in my head of what my wedding day would be like. Ever since I was a little girl. The perfect dress, the perfect ceremony, the perfect everything. I wanted it to be a day where I could finally feel like I was enough, like I had done everything right. And when the dress failed me, it felt like I had failed. I know it's irrational, but I couldn't help it. I felt like I wasn't good enough. Eun Kyung listened carefully, feeling a deepening sense of empathy for her client. Seo Jun's emotions weren't just tied to the dress, they were tied to a lifetime of expectations, of trying to live up to an ideal that was impossible to reach. The dress had been a symbol of all those pressures, and when it had slipped, it wasn't just a wardrobe malfunction. It was a collapse of everything Seo Jun had tried to build for herself. It's not silly, Eun Kyung said quietly. I understand. The dress represented more than just the wedding, it was about proving something to yourself. And when it didn't go as planned, it felt like a personal failure. Seo Jun nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Exactly. I know it's just a dress, but it felt like it was the final proof that I couldn't live up to everyone's expectations. Not even my own. Eun Kyung's mind raced, trying to balance the emotional depth of the case with the legal strategy she needed to build. This was about more than just the dress now, it was about showing the court that Seo Jun's emotional distress was real, valid, and deserving of compensation. The boutique's dismissal of her feelings wasn't just negligent, it was harmful. I'm going to make sure the court understands that, Eun Kyung said firmly. This isn't just about a dress. It's about the emotional weight that comes with an event like this, and how the boutique's negligence added to that burden. Over the next few days, Eun Kyung focused on gathering more evidence to support Seo Jun's claims. She reviewed customer reviews of the boutique, spoke with other brides who had worked with the shop, and found subtle patterns of dismissive behavior from the staff when brides expressed concerns. It was all part of a larger pattern, one that Eun Kyung would use to show that the boutique had failed to take its clients' needs seriously, especially when it mattered most. As the trial date approached, Eun Kyung felt confident in her strategy. She wasn't just going to argue breach of contract. She was going to show that the boutique's failure went beyond the technicalities of a dress fitting. It had impacted Seo Jun on a deep emotional level, and the law had a duty to recognize that. This case, like the others Eun Kyung had taken on recently, was pushing her to understand the complex interplay between law and emotion. And with each new challenge, she found herself growing, both as a lawyer and as a person. The day of the trial arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with anticipation. Eun Kyung sat at the defense table, her notes and files meticulously organized in front of her. Across the room, the representatives from the bridal shop, led by Mrs. Kwan's legal team, looked equally prepared, their confidence radiating as they whispered amongst themselves. The room was quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of papers and murmured conversations. But beneath that calm exterior, the tension was palpable. Eun Kyung had spent countless hours preparing for this day, focusing on the contractual failures that had led to Seo Jun's humiliating experience on her wedding day. Her argument was clear. The boutique had failed to meet its contractual obligations, delivering a dress that was not properly fitted and dismissing Seo Jun's concerns in the process. Legally, It was a strong case, with clear evidence that the service provided was subpar, and that Seo Jun had suffered because of it. But today, as she sat next to her client, Eun Kyung could feel the weight of something more than just legal strategy. Over the past few weeks, she had come to understand Seo Jun's emotions in a way that she hadn't anticipated. The case wasn't just about breach of contract. It was about the deep emotional impact that the boutique's negligence had on Seo Jun. The dress wasn't merely a product. It was the centerpiece of her hopes, her dreams, and her desire to meet the societal expectations placed upon her. The failure of the dress wasn't just a technical error, it was a blow to her sense of self-worth, her ability to live up to the image of perfection she had created for her wedding day. As the judge called the courtroom to order, Eun Kyung felt a surge of calm, focus wash over her. She had a job to do, and it wasn't just about winning the case, it was about making sure that Seo Jun's story was heard, understood, and validated. The trial began with the plaintiff's side, led by the bridal boutique's lawyers. They wasted no time in presenting their version of events, painting the shop as a reputable business with years of experience, a history of satisfied customers, and a meticulous attention to detail. Their defense centered around the argument that Seo Jun had refused the final fitting, and that any issues with the dress were a result of her own negligence, not the shop's. Mrs. Kwan herself took the stand, delivering her testimony with the polished confidence of someone who had been in the industry for decades. She emphasized the professionalism of her staff, the high standards they upheld, and the care they took with each and every bride. To the casual observer, it would have seemed like an open and shut case in the boutique's favor. But Eun Kyung knew better. She had anticipated these arguments and had prepared accordingly. When it was her turn to cross-examine Mrs. Kwan, she remained calm and direct, guiding the conversation back to the heart of the issue: the boutique's failure to provide the service they had promised. Mrs. Kwan, Eun Kyung began, her voice steady but pointed, "You testified that your boutique offers a personalized and professional service to every bride. Is that correct?" "Of course," Mrs. Kwan replied smoothly. "We pride ourselves on it." And yet, despite Miss Seo Jun's repeated concerns during the fitting process, you assured her that the dress would fit perfectly on the day of the wedding, even though no final adjustments were made. Is that also correct? Mrs. Kwan hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yes, we assured her, because we've seen similar concerns from other brides. It's not uncommon for nerves to cause some anxiety about the fit. But Miss Seo Jun's concerns weren't just about nerves, were they?" Eun Kyung pressed. She explicitly stated that the dress didn't feel right. And instead of addressing those concerns, your staff dismissed them, reassuring her without actually making the necessary adjustments. "Isn't that true?" There was a brief pause as Mrs. Kwan's calm demeanor faltered slightly. "We did what we believed was best. Brides often don't fully understand the intricacies of a custom-made dress." Eun Kyung seized the moment. "But as professionals, it's your responsibility to address those concerns, correct? To ensure that the dress fits as promised, especially when the bride is relying on your expertise." Mrs. Kwan's face tightened, and she responded more cautiously this time. "Yes, that's our responsibility." Eun Kyung could feel the tide beginning to turn. She continued her cross-examination, highlighting the contractual promises that the boutique had failed to uphold and driving home the point that Seo Jun's concerns had been valid, even if they had been dismissed at the time. But as the trial progressed, Eun Kyung found herself increasingly aware of the emotional undercurrents in the courtroom. Each time Seo Jun's story was told, each time her humiliation was recounted, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The jury listened closely, their expressions softening as they began to understand that this case wasn't just about a dress, it was about a woman who had placed her trust in a system designed to make her feel beautiful and special, only to be let down in the most public and personal way. When it was time for Seo Jun to take the stand, Eun Kyung guided her gently through her testimony. Seo Jun spoke quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she recounted the events of her wedding day. She described the moment the dress slipped, how she had felt all eyes on her, the laughter, the whispers, the crushing weight of embarrassment that followed. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke, but she held them back, her voice steady even as the emotion in the room grew thick. "I know it was just a dress," Seo Jun said softly, her voice breaking slightly. "But that dress was supposed to make me feel beautiful, confident perfect. And when it didn't, when it failed, it felt like I had failed. Like I wasn't enough. Eun Kyung watched Seo Jun closely, feeling a deep sense of responsibility for her client. This was the moment she had been working toward, not just a legal victory, but an acknowledgement of the pain that Seo Jun had carried with her since that day. When it was Eun Kyung's turn to present her final argument, she stood before the jury, her mind clear, her purpose sharp. "Members of the jury," she began, her voice strong but calm. "This case is about more than just a dress. It's about trust. Miss Seo Jun trusted this boutique to provide her with a gown that would fulfill the promise of one of the most important days of her life. She trusted them to take her concerns seriously, to make her feel confident and beautiful on a day that was meant to be perfect. But instead, her concerns were dismissed, her trust was broken, and her experience was tainted." Eun Kyung took a breath, letting the weight of her words sink in. "What we're asking for today is not just compensation for a failed service. We're asking for recognition of the emotional impact that this failure had on Miss Seo Jun. The boutique failed to meet their contractual obligations, yes. But more than that, they failed to recognize the importance of their role in one of the most significant moments of her life." She paused, looking around the room, meeting the eyes of each juror before continuing. "This case isn't just about a wedding dress. It's about understanding that behind every contract, behind every service, there is a person with hopes, dreams, and emotions. And when those are dismissed, the damage is far more than financial. It's personal. It's emotional." As she finished her argument, the courtroom was silent. Eun Kyung returned to her seat, glancing at Seo Jun, who gave her a small, grateful smile. For the first time in weeks, Eun Kyung felt a sense of calm settle over her. She had done everything she could, not just as a lawyer, but as someone who had come to understand the depth of her client's pain. Now it was up to the jury to decide. The courtroom victory for Seo Jun had been bittersweet for Eun Kyung. Though she had won the case and ensured justice for her client, something inside her still felt unresolved. For days after the trial, a quiet restlessness had settled over her, as though her mind was distracted by a storm she couldn't quite define. And it wasn't just the emotional weight of the case. No, there was something else, something that had been building quietly in the background, waiting for its moment to break through. That something was Chung-hee. Since the trial, they had shared more moments working late nights together, exchanging brief but meaningful conversations in the hallways, grabbing coffee in the early morning hours before the rest of the office stirred to life. And while Eun Kyung had always appreciated his kindness, lately, it had become harder to ignore the way his presence made her feel unsettled. It wasn't a bad feeling, not exactly, but it was unfamiliar, and for someone like Eun Kyung, who lived in a world of logic and certainty, unfamiliar feelings were difficult to manage. She was used to processing facts, dissecting arguments, and analyzing details. But when it came to emotions, especially emotions as complex as the one she now felt around Chung, she was lost. The tension between them had been quietly growing, like an unspoken thread that stretched tighter with each interaction. Eun Kyung could feel it every time they spoke, a weight that lingered between them, unacknowledged but ever present. She wasn't sure how to handle it, wasn't even sure if she wanted to handle it. All she knew was that something was happening, and she wasn't prepared for it. The moment finally came one quiet evening. Eun Kyung was still at the office, sitting at her desk long after most of the other employees had gone home. The soft glow of her computer screen illuminated her face, but she wasn't really focused on the document in front of her. Her thoughts kept drifting, her mind replaying the day's interactions with Chung, his casual smiles, the way he always seemed to notice when she was overwhelmed, how he had a knack for showing up just when she needed a brief reprieve from the chaos of her cases. The gentle knock on her door startled her, pulling her out of her reverie. She looked up to see Chung, he standing there, his usual easy smile on his face, but with something else behind his eyes, something more serious, more intense than she had seen before. "Hey," he said softly, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "You're still here." "So are you," Eun Kyung replied, trying to sound casual, but her heart had already started to race. She could feel the tension in the room shift, becoming heavier, more charged. Chung, he walked over to her desk and leaned against it, his arms crossed as he looked down at her. "I figured I'd check in on you," he said, his voice softer now. "You've been quiet since the trial." Eun Kyung didn't know how to respond. She had been quiet, but not because of the case. She had been quiet because of him. Because of this. Whatever this was, her mind raced, searching for the right words, but nothing came out. Chung-hee exhaled slowly, his expression becoming more serious. "Eun Kyung, I need to talk to you." Something in his tone made her stomach flip, and suddenly, the room felt smaller, more confined. She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening as she looked up at him, waiting. Chung-hee hesitated for a moment, as if trying to gather his thoughts, then finally spoke. "I care about you," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity that sent a shock through her. "More than just as a colleague, more than just as a friend." Eun Kyung blinked, her mind going blank for a second as his words hit her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She hadn't been prepared for this, hadn't even considered that this might be where things were heading. And now that it was happening, she had no idea how to respond. Chung-hee continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it wasn't a big deal, but it is. You mean a lot to me, Eun Kyung. More than I think I even realized until recently." Her chest felt tight, her thoughts spinning as she tried to process what he was saying. She had never been good at understanding these kinds of feelings, romantic feelings, emotional connections that went beyond friendship. Her world had always been neatly divided into things she understood and things she didn't. And this was something she didn't understand at all. I don't know what to say," Eun Kyung finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she clasped them together to try and steady herself. I didn't expect this." Chung-hee smiled softly, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "I didn't expect it either," he admitted, "but I can't pretend it's not there. And I needed you to know." Eun Kyung looked away, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of her emotions. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, could feel the heat rising in her chest. This was too much, too sudden, too confusing. She didn't know how to process it, didn't know how to respond to something that was so far outside of her comfort zone. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to feel about this." Chung-hee stepped closer, his hand gently resting on the edge of her desk. "You don't have to know everything right now," he said softly. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to be honest with you. I care about you, Eun Kyung. I care about you a lot." His words were like a lifeline, grounding her in the midst of her swirling thoughts. She looked up at him, her heart still racing, but there was something in his eyes that made her feel safe. He wasn't pressuring her, wasn't demanding a response. He was just there, offering her the truth of how he felt, and giving her the space to process it in her own time. But the problem was, Eun Kyung didn't know how to process it. She had never been in a romantic relationship before, had never had to navigate the complexities of these kinds of feelings. She had always been focused on her work, on her cases, on the world of logic and reason that made sense to her. Emotions, especially emotions like these, were unpredictable, messy, and terrifying. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what this means. I don't even know if I feel the same way." Chung-hee nodded, his expression soft, but understanding. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to know where I stand." They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them filled with the weight of unspoken possibilities. Eun Kyung could feel the tension in the room shift again, becoming something softer, something more fragile. She wasn't ready for this, not yet, but she also wasn't running away from it. And maybe that was enough for now. As Chung-hee turned to leave, he paused at the door, glancing back at her one last time. "I'll see you tomorrow, okay?" Eun Kyung nodded, her throat tight. "Okay." When the door closed behind him, Eun Kyung exhaled shakily, her hands still trembling as she sat down at her desk. She stared at the space where Chung-hee had been standing, her mind still reeling from the confession. She didn't know how to feel, didn't know what to do next. But one thing was clear, her world had just shifted in a way she hadn't expected, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what came next. The courtroom was filled with quiet anticipation as the jury filed back into their seats, their expressions neutral and unreadable. Eun Kyung sat beside Seo Jun, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The past few days of the trial had been intense, but now, finally, the moment of truth had arrived. Seo Jun shifted nervously in her seat, glancing at Eun Kyung with a look of quiet desperation. Though she had remained composed throughout most of the trial, the weight of the outcome was clearly pressing on her now. This wasn't just about money or contracts for Seo Jun, it was about vindication, about reclaiming the dignity she had lost on her wedding day. Eun Kyung offered a small, reassuring smile. Though she was calm on the outside, her own thoughts raced beneath the surface. The trial had been a delicate balancing act, navigating not only the legal issues of breach of contract, but also the emotional weight behind Seo Jun's suffering. Eun Kyung had made it her mission to ensure that the jury understood the depth of her client's pain, that this was about more than just a dress. As the judge asked for the verdict, the jury foreman stood, clearing his throat before speaking. In the case of Seo Jun versus Mrs. Kwan's boutique, we find in favor of the plaintiff, Seo Jun. We award damages for breach of contract and emotional distress. There was a pause as the courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath, and then a soft exhale of relief from Seo Jun beside her. She turned to Eun Kyung, her eyes filled with gratitude and tears that she had been holding back for far too long. "We did it," Seo Jun whispered, her voice trembling. Eun Kyung nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You did it. You stood up for yourself, and now you've been heard." It was a victory, a hard-fought one. The boutique would have to compensate Seo Jun not only for the breach of contract, but for the emotional harm they had caused by dismissing her concerns and leaving her humiliated on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. As the judge thanked the jury and adjourned the court, people began to stand and shuffle toward the exit. But Eun Kyung remained seated for a moment, watching as Mrs. Kwan and her legal team gathered their things in silence. She could sense the quiet defeat in their posture. They had underestimated the power of emotion in this case, and now they were paying the price. Seo Jun stood beside her, wiping her eyes, and took a deep breath. "I don't even care about the money," she said softly. I just needed to know that what happened to me mattered, that I wasn't just overreacting." Eun Kyung rose to her feet, placing a gentle hand on her client's shoulder. "It did matter, and you've shown that. You fought for yourself, and that's something no one can take away." They walked out of the courtroom together, Seo Jun looking visibly lighter than she had in weeks. The victory wasn't just about legal compensation, it was about validating the feelings that had haunted her since that fateful day. Eun Kyung felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. For Seo Jun, this was a turning point, a moment of closure that would allow her to move forward. But for Eun Kyung, the case had left her with deeper reflections. As they exited the courthouse and stood in the cool autumn air, Eun Kyung found her thoughts drifting back to the nature of the trial. It wasn't just about laws or contracts, it was about how much people's lives were shaped by the expectations placed on them, expectations that could feel suffocating. Seo Jun had been weighed down by the pressure to be the perfect bride, to create the perfect wedding, to meet the impossible standards set by society. And when things hadn't gone according to plan, it wasn't just a dress that had slipped, it was the illusion of perfection that had shattered. The case had forced Eun Kyung to think more deeply about the ways in which social expectations affected everyone, including herself. She had always been someone who lived by rules, by clear boundaries, by the certainty of logic. But emotions, she was learning, didn't always follow those rules. Seo Jun's pain wasn't logical, it was emotional, born from years of internalizing society's standards about what a wedding and a bride should be. And Eun Kyung couldn't ignore the fact that she too had been living under the weight of expectations for as long as she could remember. Her life had been defined by her brilliance in the legal field, by her success in her career, by her ability to prove herself in a world that had often doubted her because of her social challenges. She had always focused on being the best lawyer she could be, using her sharp mind and attention to detail to win cases. But recently, something else had started to shift within her, something that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with feelings she didn't fully understand. As they parted ways, Eun Kyung felt a familiar presence beside her. Chung-hee had been standing near the courthouse entrance, waiting for her, as he often did when they were working on cases together. But today felt different. The air between them was thick with the weight of his recent confession. 4 days now, since the night he had admitted his feelings for her. Eun Kyung had been trying to process what it all meant. She had never been good with emotions, least of all romantic ones. It wasn't that she didn't care about Chung-hee, she did. But understanding her own feelings and what they meant in the context of a relationship was still a struggle. "Congratulations," Chung-hee said with a small smile as she approached. "You did great in there." "Thanks," Eun Kyung replied, her voice quiet as she stood next to him. It wasn't an easy case. They fell into a comfortable silence, but it was clear to both of them that the words left unspoken were weighing heavily. Eun Kyung could feel the question lingering in the air between them. She knew that sooner or later, she would have to confront her own emotions to figure out how she truly felt about him. Chung-hee glanced at her, his expression soft. "Have you had time to think about what I said?" His question hung in the air, and for a moment, Eun Kyung felt her heart race. She looked down, feeling a wave of uncertainty wash over her. The case with Seo Jun had made her realize just how much expectation society's, others, her own shaped the way she viewed the world. And now, with Chung-hee, she was faced with expectations of a different kind, expectations of what it meant to open her heart, to let someone in, to explore emotions she wasn't even sure she understood. "I have thought about it," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not sure what to do with these feelings." Chung-hee nodded, his expression patient and kind. "It's okay, Eun Kyung. You don't have to have all the answers right now. I just wanted to be honest with you about how I feel. The rest we can figure it out together, if you're ready." There was again the gentle understanding that defined Chung-hee. He wasn't rushing her, wasn't pushing her for a response she wasn't ready to give. He was giving her space, allowing her to process her feelings in her own time, in her own way. And for the first time, Eun Kyung felt a small flicker of something that resembled acceptance, not just of him, but of herself. Maybe she didn't need to have all the answers right now. Maybe it was okay to not fully understand her emotions. What mattered was that she was starting to open herself up to the possibility that emotions didn't have to make sense. They just had to be felt. "I don't know what this means," she admitted, her voice steady but soft. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to figure it out." Chung-hee smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "That's all I could ever ask for." They stood there in the fading light, the courthouse behind them, the city buzzing softly around them. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Eun Kyung felt a sense of peace settle over her. The world was full of uncertainties about emotions, about relationships, about the expectations placed upon her, but for now, she was willing to embrace that uncertainty. And that, she realized, was enough. The months following Seo Jun's victory marked a period of quiet transformation for Eun Kyung. The courtroom had always been a place where she felt at ease, where the rigid rules of law offered a structure she could rely on. But now, something had shifted. The victory had not only solidified her reputation as a skilled attorney, but had also opened doors she hadn't expected, doors that led to personal growth she had long avoided. In the aftermath of the case, Eun Kyung's presence at Hanbada law firm became more respected than ever before. Her handling of Seo Jun's case, balancing both the legal intricacies and the emotional depth of her client's experience, had earned her the recognition of her colleagues, many of whom had initially doubted her. She was no longer just a brilliant but socially awkward attorney with a mind for details. She was a force to be reckoned with. Do Yoon, her once skeptical boss, had grown to admire her perseverance and quiet strength, often praising her ability to navigate difficult cases with both intellect and empathy. "Your work on Seo Jun's case was exceptional," Yoon had said to her in a private meeting one afternoon. "I've seen many lawyers who know the law, but few who can connect with their clients the way you did. You've grown, Eun Kyung." The words had taken her by surprise. Praise was not unfamiliar to her. She had always been recognized for her intelligence, for her sharp legal mind, but this was different. This wasn't just about her knowledge of the law. It was about her ability to see beyond it, to understand the people behind the cases she took on. She had always known she was capable of great things as a lawyer, but for the first time, she felt like she was becoming more than just a legal mind. She was becoming someone who could balance the cold logic of her profession with the warmth of human emotion. But while Eun Kyung's professional life had reached new heights, the more significant changes were happening within herself. For so long, She had distanced herself from the emotional complexities of life, preferring the safety of logic and routine. But the events of the past few months, the cases, the clients, and especially Chung, he had forced her to confront the emotional undercurrents she had always ignored. Her relationship with Chung, he had been tentative at first. His confession had left her confused, unsure of how to respond to the feelings he had stirred within her. But as time passed, she found herself slowly opening up to him in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't easy. Eun Kyung still struggled to understand the nuances of romantic relationships, the give and take of emotional intimacy. She often worried that she was missing something, that her inability to read certain social cues would make things difficult. But Chung, he had been patient, as he always was. He never pushed her to be something she wasn't, never demanded that she move faster than she was ready for. He simply was there, a constant presence, steady and reassuring, offering her the space she needed to process her emotions in her own time. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, they found themselves sitting on a park bench just outside the firm, the city's evening lights flickering in the distance. The air was cool, a soft breeze rustling the leaves overhead, and for a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the world around them fading into the background. "I've been thinking," Eun Kyung said quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "About everything. About us." Chung, he turned to her, his expression soft but attentive. "What about us?" She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her coat. "I don't always know what I'm doing. I don't always understand these feelings, or what they mean, but I'm trying." Chung, he smiled, the warmth in his eyes making her chest tighten. "You don't have to have all the answers, Eun Kyung. We're figuring this out together. That's all that matters." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled over her like a blanket of calm. For so long, she had believed that she needed to have everything figured out, that she needed to be in control of her emotions the way she was in control of her legal arguments. But now, sitting there beside him, she realized that maybe it was okay to not have everything sorted out. Maybe it was okay to let things unfold, to let herself feel without analyzing every detail. "I never thought I'd have someone like you in my life," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd let myself feel this." Chung, his smile grew, and he reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I'm not going anywhere. We'll take this one step at a time, okay?" Eun Kyung nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. It was still strange to her, the way her emotions seemed to slip out of her grasp whenever she was with him. But instead of resisting them, she was beginning to accept that maybe, just maybe, she didn't need to control everything. Maybe letting someone in, letting herself be vulnerable, was part of the growth she had been avoiding for so long. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. As time passed, Eun Kyung continued to build her career, taking on more complex cases, earning the respect of her peers, and growing into a lawyer who was not only brilliant but compassionate. She learned to trust her instincts not just in the courtroom, but in her personal life as well. She began to understand that being strong didn't mean being closed off. It meant allowing herself to feel, to care, to connect even when it scared her. And through it all, Chung, he remained by her side. Their relationship, still new and fragile, blossomed slowly but steadily. They shared quiet moments, long conversations, and occasional laughter that surprised even her. There were still moments of uncertainty, times when she doubted herself, when she wasn't sure how to express her feelings in the way she thought she should, but Chung, his patience never wavered. He never asked for more than she could give, and in return, she found herself giving more than she ever thought she could. In the end, it wasn't about having all the answers. It was about embracing the journey, about understanding that growth came in small steps, not giant leaps. Eun Kyung had spent so much of her life trying to prove herself, trying to meet the expectations of those around her. But now, she was learning to trust herself, to trust that she was enough, just as she was. The last time she met with Do-Yoon, he had congratulated her again on her continued success at the firm. But what stuck with her wasn't the praise for her legal work, it was the recognition of her personal growth. The acknowledgement that she had become someone who could balance the demands of her career with the complexities of her emotions. "You've come a long way," Do-Yoon had said with a knowing smile. "I'm proud of the lawyer you've become. But more than that, I'm proud of the person you're becoming." And in that moment, Eun Kyung finally understood what he meant. She was still learning, still growing, still facing challenges both professionally and personally. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of those challenges. She welcomed them. She welcomed the uncertainties, the questions, the emotions that still sometimes confused her. Because she knew, deep down, that she was on the right path. And as she walked out of the firm that evening, her hand slipping into Chung Hee's as they stepped into the cool night air, Eun Kyung realized something she hadn't fully understood before. She wasn't alone anymore. She had found her way, and she was ready for whatever came next.